Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest chapters, a time when simply being born female meant you were considered diseased from your very first breath. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that doctors, scientists, and society itself believed your body was fundamentally broken. Not because of anything you did, but simply because you were a woman. This isn't fiction, this happened. And tonight, we're uncovering why Victorian women were taught to fear the very bodies they lived in. So before we dive deeper into this story together, I have a small request. If you find yourself drawn into these historical revelations, if something I share tonight resonates with you, or opens your eyes to something new, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you tucked into bed in California, perhaps brewing tea in London, or maybe watching the sunrise somewhere in Australia? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle ambient sound, and let's step back in time together. Picture this. London, 1873. A young woman, we'll call her Eleanor, sits in a physician's office. She's 22 years old, educated for a woman of her time, and she's come because she's been feeling tired lately. Maybe she's had some headaches. Perhaps she's felt a bit breathless walking up the stairs in her family's townhouse. Normal things, really. Things that could happen to anyone. But Dr. Thomas Smith Clouston looks at her across his mahogany desk, and before she's even finished describing her symptoms, he's already made his diagnosis. Not because of what she's told him, but because of what she is, a woman, and in Dr. Clouston's professional medical opinion, an opinion shared by virtually every physician in England and America at this time, that fact alone explained everything. You see, Dr. Clouston had written something that became almost gospel in medical circles. He declared, and I quote, "Perfect health is a blessing to all, but it means even more to women than men." Now that might sound supportive at first, right? Like he's being considerate. But read between the lines. What he's actually saying is that women can never truly achieve perfect health. That for women, health is this distant, almost unreachable ideal, whereas for men, it's simply the default state of being. Let me paint you a fuller picture of what medical science believed about women in the Victorian era. This isn't an exaggeration or a simplification. This is what they actually taught in medical schools, what they published in prestigious journals, what they used to make decisions about women's lives, education, and futures. According to the leading medical minds of the time, the male body was the standard, the ideal, the blueprint of what a human being should be. Strong, rational, capable. A man's body equipped him for work, for debate, for leadership. His muscles were designed for labor. His brain was wired for logic. His very essence was independence and strength. And women? Women were viewed as essentially defective versions of men. I know that sounds harsh, but this was literally the medical consensus. Dr. Charles Bingham Penrose, a prominent American physician whose work was widely read in Britain and America, described the female body as suffering from what he called systemic derangement. Think about that word, derangement, a word we usually associate with madness, with things gone terribly wrong. That's what he called normal female physiology. Penrose wrote that women, being more delicately organized than men, were predisposed to a variety of pathological conditions. He described puberty, as the moment when a young woman succumbed to a state of ill health which would burden her for the rest of her life. Not entered womanhood, not matured, succumbed, like she was falling victim to a disease. Now, let's pause here for a moment and really think about what this meant. Imagine being a teenage girl in 1875. You're experiencing your first menstrual period. Your breasts are developing. Your body is changing in ways that are completely natural, completely normal. These changes have been happening to women since the dawn of humanity. But your doctor, your parents, your teachers, everyone around you is telling you that these changes represent illness, that your body is now deranged, that the very characteristics that make you female, your capacity to menstruate, to bear children, to nurse a baby, are fundamental impairments. Penrose wasn't alone in this thinking. Medical textbooks of the era referred to women's reproductive organs, the menstrual cycle, even the capacity for pregnancy as pathological conditions. They genuinely believed that breasts, ovaries, the uterus, the very organs that enable human reproduction, were somehow diseased by their nature. And the consequences of this belief, they were staggering. Young women were told they could not cope with long school hours and close mental application. Why? Because their delicate, diseased bodies simply couldn't handle it. The blood flow required for thinking, doctors claimed, would be diverted away from their reproductive organs, causing irreparable damage. Yes, they actually believed that if a woman thought too hard, her uterus might malfunction. I wish I were making this up. Physical exercise? Absolutely not. A woman's fragile constitution couldn't handle the strain. Never mind that working-class women were out there scrubbing floors, hauling water, working in factories for 12-hour shifts. The medical establishment wasn't particularly concerned with them. These rules were designed for respectable middle and upper-class women who needed to be protected from the dangerous activities of reading books and taking walks. Let me share a specific example that really illustrates how absurd this got. There was a case documented in 1864 at the Toronto Asylum. A woman was admitted and diagnosed with mania. Not an uncommon diagnosis for women at the time, as we'll explore in future episodes. But here's the thing, the cause cited by the doctors for her insanity wasn't trauma, wasn't a head injury, wasn't anything we might recognize today as a legitimate medical trigger. The cause listed in her medical records was lactation, breastfeeding. She was declared insane because she was feeding her baby the way women have fed babies for millennia. This gets even more disturbing when you understand how this pseudoscience was used to control women's lives. Universities began refusing to admit women, citing medical evidence that education would damage their reproductive systems. Employers refused to hire women for jobs requiring mental effort. Politicians argued that women couldn't vote because the stress of political thought would literally make them sick. And the most insidious part, many women believed it. When you hear from every authority figure in your life, your doctor, your father, your teachers, the newspapers, the books, that your body is fundamentally flawed, that you're constitutionally weaker than men, that your very nature predisposes you to illness, you start to internalize it. You start to fear your own body. You start to believe that any ambition beyond marriage and motherhood is not just socially inappropriate, but medically dangerous. There's this heartbreaking pattern in Victorian women's diaries and letters. You see women apologizing for their bodies, apologizing for feeling tired, for having headaches, for experiencing normal physical sensations. They write about feeling like burdens, like their inherent weakness is letting down their families. One woman wrote to her sister, "I know I am a poor, weak creature, and I must learn to accept my limitations." She was 19 years old. The medical profession created this elaborate framework to justify keeping women out of public life. And here's what makes it so clever in a twisted way. They disguised oppression as protection. They weren't keeping women down, oh no, they were keeping women safe. They weren't denying women opportunities, they were shielding women from harm. After all, how could anyone argue against protecting the health of delicate, fragile women? But let's talk about what this really was. This was the systematic medicalization of gender, the use of scientific-sounding language and medical authority to enforce social hierarchies. Because here's the thing, if being female is inherently pathological, if women are naturally biologically unavoidably weaker and more prone to illness than men, then of course men should be in charge. Of course men should have all the power, make all the decision, control all the resources. They're the healthy ones. They're the capable ones. Women are just too sick to participate. And this belief was everywhere. It wasn't just fringe medicine. This was mainstream, accepted, published in prestigious journal science. The kind of science that shaped laws, influenced education policy, determined who could vote, who could own property, who could make decisions about their own lives. Think about Eleanor again sitting in that doctor's office. She came in with relatively minor complaints, but she's leaving with a diagnosis that will follow her for the rest of her life. She'll be prescribed rest. She'll be told to avoid exertion, both physical and mental. She'll be encouraged to marry as soon as possible, because marriage and motherhood are considered therapeutic. They'll return her to her natural role and supposedly stabilize her wayward female body. Her brothers, meanwhile, can go to university. They can travel. They can pursue careers. They can exercise, think, dream, and aspire. And if they get tired or have headaches, it's just fatigue, not a fundamental constitutional weakness, just a temporary condition requiring rest and nutrition. The double standard is staggering when you really examine it, but that's what happens when medicine becomes a tool of oppression rather than healing. That's what happens when scientific authority is used to justify prejudice rather than to uncover truth. Now you might be wondering, surely some doctors question this? Surely someone spoke up? Well, yes and no. There were a few voices of dissent, mostly women who managed to break into the medical profession despite all the barriers. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in Britain, for instance, became the first woman to qualify as a physician in 1865, and she immediately began challenging these assumptions. But she was one voice among thousands, and the medical establishment had a convenient way of dismissing women doctors. After all, they reasoned, women doctors were probably biased. They were too emotional, too personally invested, unlike male doctors, who were objective and rational. See how that works? The system was designed to be self-perpetuating. Women's voices were dismissed because women were considered inherently unreliable, and the only voices with authority were men who had been trained in a system that taught them women were constitutionally inferior. As I sit here researching these stories, reading these old medical journals and case notes, I'm struck by how recent this was. We're not talking about the Middle Ages. We're talking about a time when photography existed, when trains crossed continents, when the telegraph connected the world. This was the modern era. These were educated people, and yet they believed that female puberty was a disease. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What beliefs do we hold today that future generations will look back on with the same horror? What are we getting wrong about bodies, about health, about who deserves care and dignity? But we're just beginning to scratch the surface of this story, because the belief that women were inherently sickly didn't just lead to discrimination. It led to actual medical conditions, actual treatments, actual interventions that shaped and often damaged women's bodies and minds. In our next part, we're going to explore one of the strangest diseases in medical history, chlorosis, also known as green sickness, a condition that supposedly affected millions of young women in the Victorian era, causing them to turn pale and green, to waste away with weakness. And here's the fascinating part. It was a disease that seemed to vanish almost overnight in the early 20th century. How does a disease affecting millions simply disappear? Well, the answer is going to surprise you, because chlorosis might never have been a real disease at all. It might have been something far more sinister, a diagnosis created to control the bodies and lives of young women who dared to step outside society's narrow expectations. But that's a story for next time. For now, rest well, and remember, your body is not your enemy, it never was. So we've talked about how Victorian medicine viewed women as inherently diseased, but what happens when that belief system creates an entirely new illness? What happens when doctors become so convinced that women are naturally sick that they start diagnosing diseases that might not even exist? Welcome to the strange case of chlorosis, the green sickness, a medical mystery that affected hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of young women across Europe and America throughout the 19th century. And then, almost like magic, it vanished, completely, gone within a single generation. How does the disease that widespread simply disappear? Well, grab your pillow a little tighter, because the answer is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Let me introduce you to Catherine. She's 17 years old, living in Boston in 1885. For the past several months, she's been feeling exhausted. She's lost her appetite. When she looks in the mirror, she notices her skin has taken on a pale, almost greenish tinge. Her mother is worried. So they visit the family physician. The doctor takes one look at Catherine and nods knowingly. Chlorosis, he announces. Classic case. I see it all the time in girls her age. He doesn't need to run extensive tests. He doesn't need to investigate further. The diagnosis is obvious to him because Catherine fits a very specific profile. She's female, she's young, somewhere between puberty and marriage, and she's pale. That's really all it took. Now, chlorosis wasn't a new diagnosis. Doctors had been identifying it for centuries, but it absolutely exploded in popularity during the Victorian era. Medical journals were filled with articles about it. Doctors competed to publish papers detailing their chlorosis cases. It became, in a very real sense, the fashionable disease of the age. If you were a young woman in the late 1800s, chances were good that you or someone you knew had been diagnosed with chlorosis. But here's where it gets interesting. Let's look at who was being diagnosed. Chlorosis was almost exclusively identified in young, unmarried women from middle and upper class families. Working class women, rarely diagnosed. Men, almost never, though there were a tiny handful of cases. Married women, occasionally but far less frequently than single girls. The symptoms were varied and frankly pretty vague. Paleness, fatigue, loss of appetite, shortness of breath, palpitations, headaches, weakness, sometimes fainting, and that greenish tint to the skin that gave the disease its name, though historians debate whether this green colour was actually visible or more of a poetic description. Now, do those symptoms sound familiar? They should, because they describe a lot of conditions. Anemia, certainly. Depression, anxiety, malnutrition. The effects of wearing a corset laced too tightly. The physical manifestation of stress and social pressure. But Victorian doctors had a different explanation, and it reveals so much about how they thought about women's bodies. According to medical theory at the time, chlorosis was caused by disturbances in the female reproductive system. Some doctors believed it was related to menstrual irregularities. Others thought it stemmed from the uterus itself, which they believed could wander around the body causing all sorts of problems. Yes, they genuinely thought the uterus was just floating around in there, bumping into other organs and causing mischief. The ancient Greeks had believed this too, which tells you something about how slowly medical understanding of women's bodies advanced. But the truly revealing part is the treatment prescribed for chlorosis. Are you ready for this? The primary cure recommended by doctors was iron supplements, which, okay, that actually makes some medical sense if we're talking about anemia. Iron deficiency causes many of the symptoms associated with chlorosis: fatigue, paleness, weakness. So the iron tonics probably did help some of these young women feel better. But the second most common treatment, marriage. I'm completely serious. Marriage was prescribed as a medical treatment for chlorosis. Doctor after doctor wrote that getting married and having children would cure green sickness. Some even suggested that remaining unmarried was dangerous for young women because it left them vulnerable to this terrible disease. Let's think about what's really happening here. You have young women, probably in their mid to late teens, stuck in homes with nothing to do but needlework and music practice. They can't pursue education because that's considered dangerous for their delicate brains. They can't exercise vigorously because that might damage their reproductive organs. They're laced into corsets that restrict their breathing and compress their organs. They're eating limited diets because hearty appetites are considered unladylike. They're bored, they're frustrated, they're literally and figuratively suffocating. And then doctors look at these pale, listless, unhappy young women and diagnose them with the disease that can be cured by marriage, by putting them into their proper role, by getting them pregnant and making them mothers, which was considered woman's natural healthy state. Do you see the pattern? Do you see how chlorosis functioned as a social control mechanism disguised as medical diagnosis? There's this wonderful historical detail that really drives this home. Medical literature of the time noted that chlorosis seemed to affect young women during what they called the waiting period, that stretch of time between puberty and marriage when girls were supposed to be preparing for their future as wives but had no actual purpose or occupation. They were in limbo, and that limbo made them sick. But not really sick with chlorosis, sick with restriction, sick with boredom, sick with corsets, sick with social expectations that squeezed them just as tightly as their undergarments. Let me share some specific treatments that were recommended beyond marriage and iron. Doctors prescribed travel, particularly to the seaside or the mountains. Fresh air and a change of scenery, they said, would do wonders. They recommended moderate exercise, walks in the garden, perhaps, but nothing too strenuous. They suggested special diets, often including red meat and wine to build up the blood. And here's a fascinating detail. Some doctors prescribed arsenic. Yes, arsenic, which we now know is a poison, but in small doses it can actually create a rosy flush in the cheeks, which made patients look healthier even if they weren't actually getting better. So the treatment worked cosmetically, even if it was slowly poisoning the patient. The Victorian era was wild, you guys. Some physicians recommended cod liver oil, which tastes absolutely disgusting, as anyone who had to take it as a child can attest. Others suggested bloodletting, which seems counterintuitive when treating someone for what we'd now recognise as anemia. But remember, Victorian medicine was still operating on some seriously outdated ideas about how the body worked. But through all of this, through all these treatments, the message to young women was clear. Your body is the problem, not society's restrictions on you, not the corset cutting into your ribs, not the suffocating boredom of having nothing meaningful to do with your mind. Your female body is malfunctioning and you need to get it back on track by fulfilling your biological destiny. Now let's jump forward to the early 20th century. World War I has just ended. Women have been working in factories, driving ambulances, serving as nurses on the front lines. They've proven they're not the fragile, delicate creatures Victorian medicine claimed they were. Fashion is changing too. Those restrictive corsets are going out of style. The new flapper dresses of the 1920s have a completely different silhouette, looser and more comfortable, and suddenly doctors start noticing something strange. Chlorosis cases are declining rapidly. By the 1930s, the disease has almost completely disappeared. Medical journals are publishing articles with titles like "The Vanishing of Chlorosis" and "Whatever Happened to Green Sickness?" In 1952, The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, published an article directly linking the disappearance of chlorosis to women no longer wearing tightly laced corsets. The British Medical Journal published similar findings. The conclusion was becoming unavoidable. Chlorosis wasn't a real disease in the traditional sense. It was a collection of symptoms caused by social restrictions, physical compression from corsets, poor nutrition, and the psychological effects of enforced idleness. Think about that for a moment. An illness that had been diagnosed for centuries, that had been the subject of countless medical papers, that had affected hundreds of thousands of women, turned out to be largely iatrogenic, caused by the very society and medical system that was trying to treat it. It's like if someone put you in a tiny box and then diagnosed you with a disease because you couldn't stretch your arms, and then the cure was putting you in an even smaller box called marriage. And then, when they finally let you out of the box, suddenly the disease disappeared, and everyone acted surprised. There's actually a perfect example that illustrates this whole dynamic. In the 1890s, there was a huge debate in medical journals about whether chlorosis was a real organic disease or a psychosomatic condition. Some progressive doctors were starting to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't in women's bodies but in how society treated women. These doctors were ridiculed. They were called too sympathetic to women's complaints, too willing to take women's suffering seriously as having external causes rather than internal biological ones. Because admitting that chlorosis was caused by corsets, by enforced idleness, by social restriction would mean admitting that society was making women sick. And that was a much more uncomfortable conclusion than simply blaming women's inherently weak constitutions. But you know what the most heartbreaking part is? The women themselves believed they were sick. They internalized the diagnosis. They wrote in their diaries about their chlorosis, about being invalids, about their weak blood and feeble constitutions. They accepted that something was fundamentally wrong with them, when really, something was fundamentally wrong with how they were being treated. And this pattern repeats throughout medical history. Whenever you see a disease that primarily affects one group of people, especially a group with less social power, it's worth asking, is this really a biological condition? Or is this what oppression looks like when it's been medicalized? Now I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying these young women weren't suffering. They absolutely were. The fatigue was real, the weakness was real, the paleness was real. But the cause wasn't some mysterious female malady. It was iron deficiency from poor nutrition, lack of oxygen from tight corsets, muscle weakness from enforced inactivity, and depression from crushing social restrictions. The tragedy is that instead of addressing those real fixable problems, doctors doubled down on the idea that being female was inherently pathological. They prescribed marriage as medicine. They used this diagnosis to push young women into their proper roles even faster. And here's something that might sound familiar to modern ears. Chlorosis was often described as the young woman just being difficult, being moody, being overly emotional. Sound like any stereotypes we still hear today? The Victorian diagnosis might be gone, but some of those attitudes about young women's emotions and complaints linger. I think about Catherine, our 17-year-old from Boston. After her diagnosis, she probably took iron tonics that made her feel a bit better. She probably was encouraged to marry young, to settle into domestic life. And if she did feel better after marriage, everyone would point to it as proof that the cure worked, that marriage was the medicine she needed. But was it? Or did she simply get older, develop better coping mechanisms, maybe loosened her corset a bit, maybe found small ways to assert some autonomy in her life? We'll never know, because the narrative had already been written for her. She was sick because she was a young unmarried woman, and marriage made her well because that's what women's bodies are designed for. The disappearance of chlorosis proves something really important. that medical diagnoses don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by social beliefs, by who has power, by what's considered normal versus abnormal. And when the social conditions change, sometimes the diseases change too, or in this case disappear entirely. So the next time you hear about an illness that seems to predominantly affect one group of people, especially a marginalized group, it's worth digging deeper. It's worth asking who benefits from that diagnosis. It's worth examining whether we're treating a disease or pathologizing a normal response to abnormal circumstances. But chlorosis is just one piece of this puzzle, because while doctors were diagnosing young women with green sickness, they were also advocating for something that would actively create many of those symptoms, something that would compress organs, restrict breathing, and cause the very weakness and paleness they were supposedly treating. Next, we're diving into one of the most visible and controversial aspects of Victorian women's lives, the corset. We've mentioned it briefly, but now we're going to explore the full story. How tight lacing became a standard practice, what it actually did to women's bodies, and we have the skeletal evidence to prove it. How some women became so dependent on their corsets they couldn't stand without them, and how this single garment encapsulates everything about how Victorian society literally and metaphorically squeezed women into shape. Trust me, the reality is even more shocking than you might imagine. Here's something that might blow your mind. Take a moment and measure around your head with your hands. Go ahead, I'll wait. Got it? Now imagine your waist being smaller than that. Not slightly smaller, significantly smaller. That's what women were aiming for in the Victorian era. A waist measurement of 17 to 19 inches. For context, the average adult human head measures about 22 to 23 inches in circumference. Let that sink in for a second. Your waist smaller than your head. And this wasn't some rare extreme. This was the beauty standard. This was what fashion plates showed, what mothers taught their daughters to achieve, what society expected from respectable women. They even had a name for it, the wasp waist. But how did women actually achieve this? Well, that's where our story gets really dark. Because creating a waist that small required starting young. Very young. Meet Margaret. She's 6 years old, and this morning, like every morning for the past year, her mother is lacing her into a corset, not a gentle, supportive garment. A rigid cage of whalebone and steel. Margaret cries. She says it hurts. She says she can't breathe. Her mother tells her that beauty requires sacrifice, that this is what proper young ladies do, that she'll get used to it. And here's the thing. Her mother isn't being cruel by the standards of her time. She's being a good mother. She's preparing her daughter for society. Because in the Victorian world, a woman who couldn't achieve the fashionable silhouette was considered sloppy, unfeminine, possibly even immoral. The corset wasn't optional. It was mandatory for respectability. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You've probably heard that the whole tight lacing thing is exaggerated, that most women wore corsets comfortably, that the horror stories are overblown. And you know what? There's some truth to that. Not all corsets were instruments of torture. Many women did wear them at a moderate tightness. Working-class women needed to move and work in their corsets, so they couldn't lace them to the point of incapacitation. But here's what we also know, and this part is not exaggerated. Tight lacing was real. It was documented. It was common enough that doctors wrote extensive papers about it. And we have the physical evidence to prove it. Right now, sitting in museums around the world, are human skeletons that tell this story far better than I ever could. One of the most famous is on display at the Old Operating Theatre Museum in London. Her name was Mrs. Grieve, and when visitors see her skeleton, the first thing they notice isn't her skull or her height. It's her rib cage. It's profoundly deformed. Her ribs curve inward at sharp angles, creating a waist in the bone itself. This isn't something that happened after death. This is what decades of tight lacing did to her living skeleton. Dr. William Flower, writing in the 1880s, described examining the ribcage of an elderly woman who had worn tight corsets her entire life. He noted that the lower ribs were pushed inward and the organs shifted upward from the region of the waist. Think about what that means. Her liver, her stomach, her intestines, all pushed up into her chest cavity because there was literally no room for them where they were supposed to be. In 1793, a German physician named Samuel Thomas von Sommering published a groundbreaking work titled On the Effects of the Corset. In it, he documented case after case of women suffering from compressed organs, fractured ribs, and chronic digestive problems. He argued that tight lacing was contributing to tuberculosis, cancer, and spinal deformities. His work included detailed anatomical drawings showing the comparison between a normal ribcage and one deformed by corseting. The difference is shocking, but here's where it gets even more disturbing. Von Sommering published this in 1793. That's 232 years ago. And yet tight lacing continued to get more extreme throughout the next century. Why? Because fashion mattered more than health. Because beauty standards overruled medical evidence. Because women's bodies were seen as something to be sculpted and shaped, regardless of the cost. Let me paint you a picture of what actually happened to a woman's body when she practiced extreme tight lacing. We're going to get medical here, but I'll keep it accessible. First, the lungs. With the ribcage compressed, the lungs can't fully expand. Women who tight-laced frequently reported shortness of breath, and this wasn't just from exertion. They couldn't take deep breaths even when sitting still. Some women would faint multiple times a day because they simply weren't getting enough oxygen. Fainting became so associated with fashionable ladies that people genuinely believed women were just naturally prone to swooning. But it wasn't nature. It was suffocation by fashion. Second, the digestive system. Your stomach needs room to expand when you eat, right? But if it's being compressed by whalebone and steel, there's nowhere for it to go. Women who wore tight corsets often experienced chronic indigestion, nausea, and constipation. Many developed what we now recognize as acid reflux disease. Some couldn't eat full meals and had to survive on tiny portions throughout the day, which contributed to malnutrition and made them even weaker. Third, the liver and spleen. These organs are in the upper abdomen, right where the corset squeezed tightest. Prolonged compression could actually change their shape. Doctors performing autopsies on women who had worn tight corsets their entire lives found livers that were deeply grooved, almost split in two by the constant pressure. And the spine. Oh, the spine. The unnatural posture required by tight lacing, chest thrust forward, shoulders back, pelvis tilted, put enormous strain on the vertebrae. Many women developed what's now called kyphosis or scoliosis. Their backs became permanently curved even when the corset was removed. But here's perhaps the most insidious effect: muscle atrophy. See, when you wear a corset that's doing all the work of holding up your torso, your back and abdominal muscles don't have to do anything, and muscles that don't get used become weak. Women who had worn tight corsets since childhood often found that they literally could not stand upright without them. Their muscles had never developed the strength to support their own bodies, and it gets worse. These women became dependent on their corsets in another way too. Doctors noticed something strange. Women who had worn corsets for years would sometimes faint when they removed them. Why? The theory at the time was that when the compression was suddenly released, blood would rush downward through the body too quickly, causing a drop in blood pressure and loss of consciousness. So women had to keep wearing their corsets even when sleeping, because taking them off was dangerous. Can you imagine that? Being so shaped by a garment that you can't safely remove it. That's not fashion. That's imprisonment. Now, let me share a specific historical account that really brings this home. In 1900, a popular American singer named Emma Thursby wrote a letter to a friend. I mentioned her briefly earlier, but the full story is worth hearing. She had ordered what was marketed as a doctor's corset, supposedly healthier, medically designed. She wore it for exactly 2 days before writing, and I quote, "Wore it 2 days and was nearly killed. It upset all my internal arrangements and made me sick at my stomach." Think about that phrase, upset all my internal arrangements. That's a very polite Victorian way of saying the corset displaced her organs so severely she became violently ill. And this was supposed to be one of the healthy corsets. Her doctor told her she should never wear them again, but she had to order a different, more expensive one instead because going without a corset entirely wasn't socially acceptable. Here's a question for you. Have you ever worn something uncomfortable for the sake of looking good? Maybe shoes that hurt your feet, or jeans that are a bit too tight, or shapewear that's restrictive? Most of us have. Now multiply that discomfort by about 1,000, make it something you wear from the time you're 6 years old until you die, and make it so tight it permanently changes your bone structure. That's what we're talking about. The corset industry knew what they were doing, by the way. As medical evidence mounted about the dangers of tight lacing, they didn't stop making restrictive corsets. Instead, they got clever with marketing. They started advertising health corsets and hygienic stays that were supposedly better for you. Some of these genuinely were less restrictive, with elastic panels and better design. But many were just the same old torture devices with the new name. There were reformers, of course. Women like Ada Sarah Balin, who studied hygiene and public health at University College London in the 1880s. She published a book called The Science of Dress in Theory and Practice, in which she detailed the medical harms of tight lacing and advocated for more rational clothing. She faced enormous backlash. She was called unfeminine, radical, even dangerous, because suggesting that women shouldn't deform their bodies for fashion was apparently a threat to civilization. The Rational Dress Society, formed in 1881, fought against extreme corseting. Their motto was simple: nothing that deforms or restricts the body is acceptable fashion. They held exhibitions, published pamphlets, and tried to promote healthier alternatives. But they were fighting against centuries of tradition and an entire industry built on women's insecurity about their bodies. And here's something that really illustrates the power dynamics at play. When doctors publish papers warning about the dangers of tight lacing, they often face professional consequences. They were accused of being too sympathetic to women, of taking women's complaints too seriously, of exaggerating minor discomforts. Male doctors who made corsets or profited from treating corset-related ailments had a vested interest in keeping the practice going. It's a pattern we see throughout history. When there's money to be made from women's bodies, health concerns tend to get dismissed. But some women fought back in their own ways. There are accounts of young women refusing to tight lace despite family pressure. Some would secretly loosen their corsets during the day. Others would gradually reduce the tightness over months or years, trying to find a middle ground between health and social acceptability. And then World War I happened, and everything changed. When men went to war, women took their jobs. They worked in factories, in hospitals, on farms. They drove ambulances. They did physical labour that would have been considered impossible for delicate female constitutions just a few years earlier. And you know what? They couldn't do those jobs in tight corsets. It's hard to operate heavy machinery when you can barely breathe. Fashion changed almost overnight. The elaborate gowns and restrictive undergarments gave way to more practical clothing. The 1920s brought the flapper era, with its straight, loose silhouette that required no wasp waist at all. And suddenly, for the first time in centuries, women could breathe. The corset didn't disappear entirely, it evolved into the bra and girdle, which had their own issues. But the days of tight lacing, of aiming for that 17-inch waist, of deforming your skeleton for beauty, those days were finally over. Or were they? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We're still doing versions of this today. We're still telling women their natural bodies aren't good enough. We're still promoting beauty standards that require harm. We've traded in the corset for cosmetic surgery, for extreme dieting, for shapewear that compresses and restricts. The tools have changed, but the message is the same. Your body, as it naturally exists, is wrong. You need to change it, shape it, shrink it, modify it to be acceptable. I'm not saying modern shapewear is as dangerous as Victorian tight lacing, it's not, but the underlying logic is eerily similar. And it's worth asking ourselves, what are we doing to our bodies in the name of beauty that future generations will look back on with horror? The Victorian corset is history's most visible example of beauty standards literally crushing women. But it's far from the only way Victorian society taught women to fear and fight against their own bodies. Because while corsets was squeezing women on the outside, Victorian culture was creating even deeper anxieties about what was happening on the inside. Up next, we're going to talk about something that every woman experiences, something completely natural and healthy, but something that Victorian society treated as a shameful disease requiring isolation and silence. We're talking about menstruation, the monthly curse that women couldn't speak about, couldn't prepare for, and couldn't manage with anything approaching modern hygiene. The taboos and myths surrounding this natural bodily function reveal just how deeply Victorian women were taught to be ashamed of being female. And trust me, the reality is even more shocking than you might expect. Imagine being 12 years old and waking up one morning to find blood in your bed. You have no idea what's happening to your body. No one has explained anything to you. In fact, no one has ever even mentioned that this might happen. You're terrified. You think you're dying. You run to find your mother, crying, frightened, seeking help and reassurance. And your mother's response, she slaps you across the face. This actually happened, repeatedly, throughout the Victorian era and well into the 20th century. There was a widespread belief that slapping a girl when she started her first period would bring the blood to her face and somehow regulate her cycle. But it also served another purpose. It marked the occasion with shame and pain. It taught young girls in the most visceral way possible that this natural bodily function was something shameful, something shocking, something that warranted punishment. Welcome to the Victorian approach to menstruation, a topic so taboo, so unspeakable that mothers couldn't warn their own daughters about it. A natural process reframed as a curse, a sickness, a source of contamination and danger. Let me introduce you to Sarah. She's 14, living in London in 1870. 3 months ago, she experienced her first menstrual period. She had no warning. Her mother had never spoken to her about it. The family doctor certainly hadn't. The books in her father's library were locked away. The medical texts considered too scandalous for young eyes. When it happened, Sarah genuinely believed she was hemorrhaging, that some terrible disease had struck her. Her mother eventually explained, in the most minimal terms possible, that this would happen every month. But the explanation came wrapped in warnings. Don't tell anyone. Don't let your father or brothers know. Don't even speak the word aloud. If you must reference it, use euphemisms like being unwell, or having the flowers, or simply that time. And above all, never ever let anyone suspect you're menstruating. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a medical history perspective. Victorian doctors had some truly wild theories about what menstruation actually was. Remember how we talked about chlorosis being viewed as a periodic cleansing? Well, menstruation was seen through a similar lens, but more extreme. Many physicians believed that menstruation was the body's way of expelling toxic waste, not just flushing out the uterine lining as part of a reproductive cycle, but actually purging poisons from the entire female system. Some medical texts described it as women being inherently toxic and needing monthly purification. Think about the implications of that. It wasn't just that menstruation happened to women, it was that women were fundamentally polluted creatures who required regular cleansing. This led to some genuinely bizarre medical advice. Women were told to rest completely during their periods because any exertion might disrupt the flow of toxins leaving their bodies. They were warned against physical activity, intellectual effort, even strong emotions. It was widely believed that exercise during menstruation could cause the blood to flow backward into the body, poisoning the system. There was no anatomical basis for this whatsoever, but it was taught in medical schools as fact. Let me share something that really captures how surreal this got. In 1889, a physician named Henry Hanchett published a book called Sexual Health, A Plain and Practical Guide. In it, he described a condition he called vicarious menstruation. He claimed that if normal menstruation was blocked or disrupted, the body would find alternative ways to expel menstrual blood, through the nose, through the lungs, through the eyes even. He provided case studies of women supposedly menstruating through their tear ducts. This was not fringe science, you guys. This was published medical literature, widely read and cited. And it reveals something crucial about how Victorian medicine viewed women's bodies, as mysterious, unpredictable, fundamentally unstable. A body that might start bleeding from your eyeballs at any moment is a body you definitely fear, right? But let's get practical for a moment, because the daily reality of managing menstruation in the Victorian era was incredibly difficult. There were no commercial sanitary products, no disposable pads, certainly no tampons. The very idea would have been scandalous. So what did women use? Cloth. Specifically, reusable cloth materials that Victorian women called napkins, rags, or clouts. These were pieces of flannel, cotton, or linen, folded and held in place by their undergarments. Some women fashioned them into pad-like shapes. Others used long strips of cloth that could be pinned or tucked into place. The wealthier might have had special menstrual belts with attachable cloth pads, though these were rare and expensive. And here's the thing nobody really talks about. What did you do with these cloths when they were soiled? You couldn't just throw them away. Fabric was expensive, so you had to wash them, dry them, and reuse them. But washing menstrual cloths presented a huge problem in Victorian households. Remember, most middle and upper class homes had servants who did the laundry. But menstruation was so taboo that many women couldn't bear the thought of a servant seeing their menstrual cloths, so they'd wash them secretly, often in their own wash basins, in their own rooms, with cold water because hot water wasn't readily available in bedrooms. Then they'd have to dry them somewhere discreet, which in a household full of family members and servants was nearly impossible. Some women would wait until night time to wash them, working by candlelight. Others would hide the cloths in their rooms for days, waiting for a chance to deal with them privately. The shame and secrecy made basic hygiene incredibly difficult. And if you were a working-class woman, if you were a factory worker, a domestic servant, a seamstress working 12-hour days, you might not have access to enough clean cloth. You might not have any private space to change. You'd have to make do with whatever you could find, often going hours or even a full day without being able to change, risking infection and certainly experiencing discomfort. There's a heartbreaking account from a woman working in a textile mill in the 1880s who described using newspaper when she couldn't get cloth. Newspaper. Can you imagine how uncomfortable, how utterly inadequate that would be? And she couldn't take breaks to change because taking breaks meant losing pay, and losing pay meant her family didn't eat. Now, let's talk about the medical advice women received about menstruation. They were told to rest, as I mentioned, but the level of restriction was extreme. Some physicians recommended complete bed rest for the entire duration of the period. Women were instructed to avoid stairs, to refrain from reading or sewing, to stay warm at all costs because cold was believed to stop the flow and trap toxins in the body. They were given detailed lists of foods to avoid: pickled foods, acidic foods, anything considered heating to the system, including certain spices. One medical guide from 1875 warned women against eating fresh fruit during their periods, claiming it would cause cramps and irregular bleeding. The scientific basis for this? Absolutely none. Pain management was another challenge. Menstrual cramps were acknowledged but often dismissed as either psychological or the result of women being too delicate. The treatments offered ranged from somewhat sensible to downright dangerous. Herbal teas like chamomile or raspberry leaf were common and probably did provide some comfort. Hot water bottles or warm compresses to the abdomen made sense. But many doctors also prescribed laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, for menstrual pain. And while it certainly numbed the pain, it also risked addiction. Thousands of Victorian women became dependent on laudanum, often starting with prescriptions for menstrual discomfort. Here's something that might surprise you though. Despite all the taboos, despite all the silence, women did find ways to share information with each other. There's evidence of a kind of underground network of knowledge passed quietly between women. Older sisters whispering advice to younger ones, friends sharing remedies. Women would write about their periods in diaries and letters using elaborate codes and euphemisms, creating a private language that excluded men but allowed them to communicate with each other. One woman in the 1890s wrote to her sister, "The general is visiting again and bringing his usual discomfort." Another referred to "my monthly visitor from the south." These codes allowed women to seek advice, to commiserate, to share practical tips about managing their periods without breaking the taboo of speaking about it directly. But the silence came at a terrible cost. Young women going into marriage often had almost no understanding of their own reproductive systems. They might know that they bled monthly but not understand why or what it meant. This led to some tragic misunderstandings. There are documented cases of young married women believing they could get pregnant at any time, or conversely only during their periods. The misinformation was rampant and had real consequences for family planning and women's health. And speaking of health, the obsessive secrecy around menstruation made it very difficult for women to seek medical help when they actually needed it. If you were experiencing abnormally heavy bleeding, severe pain, or irregular cycles, all things that could indicate serious medical problems, you might suffer in silence rather than face the embarrassment of discussing it with a male doctor. And almost all the doctors were male. When women did seek help, they often encountered doctors who dismissed their symptoms. "It's just your monthly trouble," they'd be told. "All women experience this. You're being overly sensitive." The assumption that women were naturally weak and prone to exaggeration meant that real medical issues often went untreated. There's a particularly disturbing pattern in Victorian medical literature where doctors describe women's menstrual complaints as evidence of hysteria or neurasthenia. If a woman said her periods were painful, that was taken as proof she was emotionally unstable, rather than as a legitimate symptom requiring investigation. It's a form of medical gaslighting that persists even today, though hopefully to a lesser degree. Now, here's a question I want you to think about. Why was menstruation treated as so much more shameful than other bodily functions? Everyone knows people eat, sleep, use the bathroom. Those things are natural too. But Victorian society found ways to discuss them, to accommodate them, to design infrastructure around them. They built elaborate plumbing systems for dealing with human waste. They developed codes of etiquette for dining. But menstruation, that remained literally unspeakable. I think the answer lies in what menstruation represented. It was a monthly reminder that women's bodies were fundamentally different from men's. It was connected to reproduction and sexuality, topics Victorian society desperately wanted to keep wrapped in mystery and shame. And perhaps most threatening of all, it was something only women experienced, something men couldn't control or fully understand. In a society built on male authority, that was deeply unsettling. The silence also served a practical purpose for the patriarchy. If you keep women ignorant about their own bodies, they're easier to control, they're more dependent on a male medical authorities, they're less likely to question what they're told. The conspiracy of silence around menstruation was, like so many things we've discussed, a tool of control disguised as propriety. Let me share one more story that I think beautifully illustrates both the absurdity and the harm of these taboos. In the early 1900s, a young woman named Marie Stopes, we'll hear more about her later, recalled that when she first got her period, she believed she had contracted tuberculosis. She'd read about hemorrhaging in novels and assumed she was dying of consumption like tragic heroines in books. She spent weeks in terror before finally working up the courage to ask an older cousin who explained the truth. Marie Stopes went on to become one of the pioneering advocates for sex education and women's reproductive health. Her experience with ignorance drove her to fight against it. But imagine how many other women went through similar terror and had no outlet, no way to channel that into change. How many women spent their entire lives ashamed of a normal bodily function because no one ever told them it was okay? The Victorian era's attitude toward menstruation perfectly encapsulates how the period, pun intended, treated women's bodies as simultaneously sacred and disgusting. Women were supposed to be pure, almost angelic, but that purity was constantly under threat from their own biology. They were celebrated for their capacity to bear children, but shamed for the bodily processes that made childbearing possible. It's a contradiction that must have been psychologically exhausting to navigate. And here's the thing. While we've made progress, the echoes of this shame still reverberate today. How many of us have been embarrassed to buy tampons? How many have hidden period products in our sleeves on the way to the bathroom? How many have heard menstruation referred to as gross or disgusting? The language has changed, the taboos have lessened, but the fundamental discomfort around this natural process hasn't entirely disappeared. But at least today we have options. We have products designed for the purpose. We have pain medication that works. We have access to gynecologists who can address medical concerns. Victorian women had none of that. They had silence, shame, and improvised solutions that barely functioned. As difficult as menstruation was to manage, as shameful as women were made to feel about it, it was far from the only way Victorian medicine pathologized normal female biology. Because there was another diagnosis, another label that doctors applied to women with startling frequency. A catch-all explanation for any woman who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. A diagnosis that could land you in an asylum, separated from your family, subjected to treatments that range from bizarre to brutal. Next, we're diving into the phenomenon of hysteria. The diagnosis that turned unhappiness into illness, frustration into madness, and nonconformity into a medical condition requiring intervention. We're going to explore how this single diagnosis was used to control, confine, and silence women whose only crime was having emotions, opinions, or desires of their own. And what you're about to hear might just make you angry. Good. It should. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from knowing your emotions could get you locked away. that a bad day, a moment of frustration, or simply having an opinion your husband disagrees with could result in you being diagnosed with a mental illness and committed to an asylum. Sounds like dystopian fiction, right? Like something from a horror movie? It was everyday reality for Victorian women. The diagnosis was called hysteria, and if you're a woman, there's a pretty good chance that at some point in the Victorian era you would have qualified for it. Were you anxious? Hysteria. Depressed? Hysteria. Tired? Irritable? Opinionated? Wanted to read books or have a career? Didn't smile enough? Smiled too much? All hysteria. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Because from the very beginning, hysteria was considered a uniquely female disease, caused by that troublesome wandering womb we talked about earlier. Even as medical understanding advanced in other areas, this fundamental belief persisted. Women were inherently prone to madness because of their reproductive organs. Let me tell you about Elizabeth. She's 32, married, living in a comfortable home in Manchester in 1878. By all external measures, her life looks perfect, but Elizabeth is desperately unhappy. Her husband is cold and controlling. She's not allowed to manage her own money, make decisions about her children's education, or even choose what books to read. She's bored, frustrated, isolated. Some days the walls of her beautiful prison feel like they're closing in. She starts crying more frequently. She has trouble sleeping. She snaps at the servants, which is considered very unladylike. She tells her husband she feels trapped, that she wishes she could do something meaningful with her life. Maybe help at a charity school or write or anything beyond managing the household. Her husband is concerned, not about her happiness, mind you, about her mental state. Because in his view, and in the view of Victorian society, a woman who isn't content with her domestic role is clearly unwell. He calls in the family physician. The doctor examines Elizabeth. He asks her a few questions, though he barely listens to her answers. He's already forming his diagnosis based on what her husband has told him. She's emotional, she's dissatisfied, she has ideas about wanting to do things outside the home. The diagnosis is obvious: hysteria. Now here's what makes hysteria such a perfect tool of control. The symptoms were so broad, so vague, that virtually any behaviour could be interpreted as evidence of it. Medical textbooks from the era list dozens, sometimes hundreds of potential symptoms. Let me read you some actual symptoms listed in Dr. George Beard's work on neurasthenia and hysteria from 1881. Nervousness, irritability, sleeplessness, unusual tiredness, headache, sensitivity to light or sound, muscle weakness, indigestion, a feeling of heaviness, sadness, inappropriate laughter, defiance, desire for education, erotic thoughts, lack of appetite, excessive appetite, and my personal favourite, a tendency to cause trouble. A tendency to cause trouble. Think about that, causing trouble, which could mean anything from questioning your husband's decisions to wanting to vote, was literally considered a symptom of mental illness. But it gets even more revealing when you look at who was being diagnosed. Yes, women from all classes could receive a hysteria diagnosis, but the patterns are telling. Wealthy women who expressed boredom with their restricted lives. Hysteria. Women who wanted divorces from abusive husbands. Hysteria. Women involved in the suffrage movement. Definitely hysteria. In fact, there are documented cases of suffragettes being force-fed during hunger strikes, not just as punishment, but as treatment for their hysteria. The reasoning went, refusal to eat is a symptom of hysteria, therefore we must feed them by force to cure their madness. Can you see how brilliant and how insidious this is? Any woman who challenged the status quo could be pathologized. Her resistance wasn't political, it was medical. She didn't need rights, she needed treatment. The system literally made rebellion into a disease. Now let's talk about the treatments, because this is where things go from disturbing to downright horrifying. The most famous treatment was the rest cure, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s. Mitchell was a respected neurologist, and his rest cure became the gold standard treatment for hysteria and neurasthenia in women. Here's how it worked. The patient would be confined to bed, complete bed rest. She couldn't get up, couldn't walk around, couldn't even sit up in many cases. This would continue for weeks, sometimes months. She was forbidden from reading, writing, or doing any intellectual activity. No visitors except immediate family, and even those visits were limited. She was fed a rich diet, lots of milk, cream, and fatty foods to build up her strength. And she was isolated in a quiet, often darkened room. The theory was that women's nervous systems were overstimulated by modern life, by too much thinking and activity. Rest would allow the nervous system to recover. In reality, it was psychological torture. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and social reformer, underwent the rest cure after experiencing postpartum depression. She later wrote a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a semi-autobiographical account of a woman driven to actual madness by the rest cure. In the story and in real life, being forbidden from writing, from thinking, from doing anything but lying in bed staring at the walls didn't cure depression. It created it or made it worse. Gilman wrote about Dr. Mitchell years later. He advised a life of domesticity. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live, he told me. She tried to follow his advice and nearly lost her mind completely. She only recovered when she abandoned the rest cure and returned to work. But the rest cure was actually one of the milder treatments. Some doctors advocated for more aggressive interventions. Hydrotherapy was popular. Patients would be plunged into ice-cold baths or subjected to powerful jets of water. The shock to the system was supposed to jolt them out of their hysteria. One account from Dr. John Bell's 1859 treatise describes a hysterical woman being bound in a cart, stripped and blindfolded, then subjected to a great fall of water from 20 feet above her head. Read that again: stripped, blindfolded, bound, and then assaulted with water. This was considered legitimate medical treatment. Other doctors prescribed morphine or laudanum for hysteria, which temporarily numbed the symptoms but led to widespread addiction among Victorian women. Some recommended bloodletting based on outdated humoral theory, and a disturbing number of physicians suggested that marriage and pregnancy were the natural cures for hysteria in single women. The logic being that once a woman fulfilled her natural role as wife and mother, her hysteria would resolve. But what if you were already married and still hysterical? Well, some doctors had a solution for that too, which brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Victorian medicine's treatment of women. But before we go there, let me share something that really illustrates how the diagnosis of hysteria affected women's lives in practical terms. In most places in Britain and America, a husband could have his wife committed to an asylum simply by getting two doctors to sign off on a hysteria diagnosis. The woman herself had no say in the matter. She couldn't refuse, she couldn't appeal, she was property, legally speaking, and if her husband deemed her unmanageable, he could have her locked away. There are documented cases of perfectly sane women being committed by husbands who wanted to be free to conduct affairs, or who wanted control of their wives' inheritances, or who simply found their wives inconvenient. Once committed, it was extraordinarily difficult to get out. Your protestations of sanity were taken as further evidence of your madness. Your anger at being unjustly imprisoned. More hysteria. The system was designed to be inescapable. One particularly tragic case involved a woman named Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, wife of the novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton. She was a writer herself, and she publicly criticised her husband's treatment of her. In 1858, he had her committed to an asylum for hysteria. Only a public outcry and intervention from her friends secured her release a few weeks later. But the threat remained. Step out of line, and back to the asylum you go. Now here's a question I want you to consider. Were these women actually experiencing psychological distress? In many cases, yes, absolutely. Depression, anxiety, what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, these were real. But here's the critical point. Their distress wasn't caused by wandering uteruses or weak female constitutions. It was caused by the conditions of their lives. Imagine being intelligent, capable and ambitious, but being told your only purpose is to be decorative and produce children. Imagine having no control over your own money, your own body or your own daily schedule. Imagine being legally the property of your husband, unable to leave even if he's cruel or unfaithful. Imagine being told that reading too much will damage your ovaries. That's enough to make anyone anxious and depressed, isn't it? But Victorian medicine looked at these distressed women and saw sick individuals, not a sick society. They prescribed rest and domesticity, the very things that were causing the problem in the first place. It's like if you locked someone in a tiny cage and then, when they started showing signs of distress, prescribed an even smaller cage as treatment. There were a few doctors who started to question this approach. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first women to earn a medical degree in America, wrote extensively about how women's supposed weakness was largely the result of poor education, restrictive clothing, and lack of exercise. She argued that if women were raised and treated like men, given good nutrition, physical training, intellectual stimulation, they would be just as strong. She published scientific studies backing this up. She was largely ignored by her male colleagues, because accepting her findings would mean admitting that the entire structure of Victorian society was harming women. Much easier to keep diagnosing hysteria and prescribing rest cures. Here's another dimension to this that's particularly fascinating and dark. The way hysteria diagnoses reflected class and race biases. Middle and upper class white women were diagnosed with hysteria and treated with rest cures. Working class women and women of colour, if they showed similar symptoms, they were more likely to be labelled as lazy, immoral, or simply bad workers. They didn't get rest cures in comfortable private facilities. If they were institutionalised at all, it was in overcrowded public asylums with far worse conditions. The diagnosis of hysteria carried a certain amount of social prestige in some circles. It marked you as sensitive, refined, perhaps too delicate for this crude world. Some wealthy women almost seemed to compete over their nervous ailments, but this was a privilege available only to women who didn't have to work for a living. If you were a factory worker or a domestic servant and claimed to be too nervous and sensitive to work, you'd simply be fired. This brings us back to Elizabeth, our woman from Manchester. After her diagnosis, her doctor prescribed a moderate rest cure. She was to spend most of her time in her room, avoid stimulation, take calming tonics, and certainly abandon any ideas about doing charitable work or writing. For a few weeks she complied, but the isolation made her feel worse, not better. She became genuinely depressed. Her husband, frustrated that the treatment wasn't working, sought a second opinion from a more aggressive physician. This doctor recommended a more intensive intervention, perhaps even a stay at a private asylum for nervous diseases, where she could receive more focused treatment. Elizabeth was terrified. She'd heard whispers about what happened in those places. Women who went in for a few weeks and stayed for years, treatments that were painful and degrading. So she did what many women in her position learned to do. She performed wellness. She smiled, she agreed with her husband, she pretended to be content. She buried her frustration and unhappiness so deep that eventually even she started to believe the performance. The symptoms of her hysteria diminished, not because she was cured, but because she'd learned to hide herself so completely that the person her husband saw bore no resemblance to who she actually was. That's what hysteria as a diagnosis really did. It didn't cure troubled women, it taught them to suppress any sign of trouble. It taught them that their feelings, their thoughts, their desires were not just inconvenient but actually symptoms of disease. It taught them to fear their own minds the same way they'd been taught to fear their own bodies. And here's the truly chilling part. The diagnosis of hysteria wasn't retired until the 1980s. 1980s, not 1880s. 1980s. It remained in medical textbooks and diagnostic manuals into the modern era. The language changed, the understanding evolved somewhat, but the fundamental tendency to pathologize women's emotions persisted for over a century after the Victorian era end. Even today, women are more likely than men to have their physical symptoms attributed to anxiety or stress. Women's pain is more likely to be dismissed or undertreated. The echo of "you're just hysterical" still reverberates in examination rooms when women try to advocate for their own health. But the Victorian approach to hysteria represents just one way that medicine intervened in women's lives, because some doctors believed that if emotional symptoms and nervous disorders were caused by the female reproductive system, then the logical solution was to alter or remove those organs entirely. Not as a last resort for life-threatening conditions, but as a primary treatment for everything from depression to epilepsy to simple disagreement with one's husband. What comes next is perhaps the most brutal aspect of Victorian medicine's war on women's bodies. We're going to talk about gynecological surgery as psychiatric treatment, about doctors who believe they could cure madness with scalpels, about women who were subjected to hysterectomies, oophorectomies, and other invasive procedures without their consent, often without even being told what was being done to them. And we're going to meet the doctors who built their careers on these surgeries, who saw women's bodies as problems to be solved through removal and mutilation. What you're about to hear is difficult, but it's important, because we can't understand how far we've come without understanding how bad things were. Take a deep breath, we're going in. What I'm about to share with you is going to sound like something from a horror film, but every word of it is documented medical history. Every procedure I'm going to describe was performed in reputable hospitals by respected physicians. Every woman whose story I tell was a real person who trusted doctors to help her, and instead had her body permanently altered in the name of curing her mind. This is the story of how Victorian medicine took the belief that women's reproductive organs cause mental illness and followed it to its most brutal logical conclusion. If the organs are the problem, simply remove them. In 1872, a physician named Dr. Robert Batty performed what he called a normal ovariotomy on a 30-year-old woman in Rome, Georgia. Normal ovariotomy. Let me translate that medical jargon for you. He removed both of a healthy woman's ovaries. Not because they were diseased, not because she had cancer or cysts or any physical pathology. He removed them because she suffered from what he described as nervous disorders and menstrual epilepsy. The surgery was considered a success. Not because it cured her epilepsy, it didn't, but because it stopped her menstrual cycle and, according to Batty's notes, made her calmer and more manageable. Within a few years, the procedure became known as Batty's operation, and it spread across America and Europe like wildfire. Surgeons lined up to perform it. They published papers about their successes. They built entire careers on removing healthy organs from mentally distressed women. And the women themselves? They had no choice in the matter. In most cases, they weren't even told what was being done to them until after the surgery was complete. Let me introduce you to Hannah. She's 28 years old, living in London in 1886. She's been married for 3 years, and she's deeply unhappy. Her husband is verbally abusive. She's had 2 miscarriages and the grief weighs on her constantly. She cries frequently, can't sleep, and has lost interest in activities she once enjoyed. We would recognize this today as depression, likely complicated by trauma and an abusive living situation. But her husband sees her condition differently. He sees a wife who isn't managing the household properly, who isn't providing him with children, who is becoming an embarrassment in social situations. He consults with the family physician, who consults with the specialist in nervous diseases of women. The specialist is Dr. Richard Morris Buckey, a prominent physician who's been studying the connection between female reproductive organs and mental health. Buck has adopted a theory that's gaining traction in medical circles, that many forms of female insanity originate in diseased or malfunctioning ovaries and uterus. His solution is surgical. Remove the source of the problem, restore the woman's mental equilibrium. Hannah is brought to see him. She's examined, though the examination is perfunctory. Buckey spends more time talking to her husband than to her. Based on the husband's description of her symptoms and Buck's brief examination, a diagnosis is made. Her ovaries are the seat of her nervous disorder. The recommended treatment is removal. Hannah is not asked for her consent. Her husband provides it on her behalf, as is his legal right. A date is set for the surgery. Now, I want you to understand what surgery meant in the 1880s. This was before antibiotics, before blood transfusions were reliably safe. Anesthesia existed, chloroform or ether, but it was inconsistently administered and dangerous in itself. And most importantly, this was before anyone understood germ theory well enough to practice proper antiseptic technique. The mortality rate for major abdominal surgery in this period was somewhere between 20 and 40%. Even if you survived the surgery itself, infection could kill you days or weeks later. Every time a surgeon opened a woman's abdomen to remove her ovaries or uterus, he was risking her life. And for what? For mental symptoms that had nothing to do with her reproductive organs, but the surgeons genuinely believed they were helping, or at least many of them did. They'd been taught that women's psychology was inextricably linked to their reproductive system. They'd seen women become calmer after surgery, though this was likely due to the trauma of the experience, the effects of opiate pain medications they were given, or simple resignation to their fate. But the doctors interpreted it as proof that their theory was correct. Hannah survives her surgery. She's in excruciating pain for weeks. The wound becomes infected, though it eventually heals, but she's changed fundamentally and irreversibly. She's been rendered infertile. She's been plunged into surgical menopause, which means hot flashes, mood swings, and bone loss. And her depression? It hasn't improved. If anything, it's worse because now she's dealing with the physical aftermath of major surgery on top of her existing mental distress. But in the medical records, her case is listed as a success because she's quieter now, more resigned. She no longer argues with her husband or expresses dissatisfaction with her life. Mission accomplished. Dr. Buckey wasn't alone in this approach. At the London Asylum in Ontario, Canada, where he worked, gynecological surgery became a regular treatment for female patients. The asylum's records show numerous cases of women diagnosed with various forms of insanity, melancholia, mania, hysteria, who underwent hysterectomies or removal of their ovaries as treatment. And here's something that should make your blood boil. These surgeries were often performed without the patient's knowledge or consent. Women would be told they were receiving an examination or a minor procedure, then wake up from anesthesia to discover that their reproductive organs had been removed. Some didn't find out for months or even years, until they realized they were no longer menstruating and asked why. The medical establishment justified this in several ways. First, they argued that insane women couldn't provide informed consent anyway, so the doctors had to act in their best interest. Second, they claimed that telling women in advance would cause anxiety that might worsen their condition. And third, they believed that women were naturally too emotional and irrational to make sound medical decisions, so male doctors and male family members should decide for them. Let me share a specific quote that encapsulates this attitude. In 1871, Dr. Seymour Hayden reported to the Obstetrical Society in London. He said, and these are his exact words, "Women are not in a position to dispute anything we say to them. We have them at our mercy." At our mercy? He actually said that, out loud, in a professional medical conference, and nobody challenged him on it. Now you might be wondering, did any of these surgeries actually help with mental symptoms? Well, there's no reliable evidence that they did. What we do have is evidence of harm. Physical harm from the surgeries themselves, infection, hemorrhage, death. Psychological harm from the violation and trauma of having your body altered without consent. And the long-term health consequences of surgical menopause, which include increased risk of heart disease, osteoporosis, and cognitive decline. But even when it became clear that these surgeries weren't achieving their stated goals, many doctors continued to perform them. Why? There are several possible reasons, and none of them are comforting. First, professional prestige. Surgeons who pioneered new techniques gained fame and status. Publishing papers about successful operations advanced careers. Batty became internationally known for his operation. That kind of recognition was powerful incentive. Second, financial motivation. These were expensive procedures. Wealthy families paid handsomely for the latest treatments for their troubled daughters and wives. A surgeon could build a lucrative practice on gynecological surgeries for nervous diseases. Third, and perhaps most disturbingly, these surgeries served a social control function. A woman who'd undergone a hysterectomy was permanently marked. She couldn't have children. In a society that defined women's value largely through their reproductive capacity, this was devastating, and she knew, everyone knew, that her body had been altered because she'd been deemed mentally unfit. It was a scarlet letter written in scar tissue. The threat of surgery could be used to keep women in line. Behave, or you'll end up on Dr. Buck's operating table. Conform or lose your womb is hard to imagine a more effective form of control. There were critics, of course. Some physicians questioned whether removing healthy organs could cure mental illness. Dr. Mary Dixon Jones, one of the few female surgeons of the era, argued that gynecological surgery should only be performed for actual gynecological disease, not psychiatric symptoms. But her voice was drowned out by the chorus of male surgeons eager to try this new approach. And here's a pattern that should sound familiar by now. When women doctors or female patients questioned these practices, they were dismissed as too emotional, too personally invested, unable to understand the science. The same logic that justified operating on women without consent was used to exclude women from the conversation about whether those operations were necessary. Let me share another case that illustrates how far this could go. In 1864, a woman was admitted to the Toronto asylum and diagnosed with mania. We talked about her briefly before, but the full story is worth telling. The cause listed for her insanity: lactation, breastfeeding her baby. Now, postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis are real conditions that need real treatment. But the Victorian approach wasn't to address the psychological aspects or provide support. It was to attack the body, specifically the reproductive system that had enabled the pregnancy in the first place. This woman likely underwent various treatments during her asylum stay, quite possibly including gynecological surgery if her symptoms persisted. Because in the Victorian medical mind the chain of causation was clear, her uterus allowed her to become pregnant, Pregnancy led to childbirth, childbirth led to lactation, and lactation somehow drove her mad. Therefore, the uterus was the ultimate culprit. It's circular logic that would be laughable if it hadn't resulted in so much suffering. Here's what makes this even more tragic. We now know that many women diagnosed with hysteria or mania in the Victorian era were suffering from conditions that had nothing to do with their reproductive organs. Thyroid disorders, epilepsy, brain tumours, nutritional deficiencies. Undiagnosed physical illnesses that manifested with psychiatric symptoms, and yes, genuine mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. But instead of investigating these possibilities, Victorian doctors went straight for the ovaries and uterus. It was like trying to fix a car engine by removing the seats. The problem and the supposed solution had no actual connection, but because the doctors believed they did, they kept operating. The practice of gynecological surgery for psychiatric conditions continued well into the 20th century, though it gradually declined as psychiatric understanding improved and as women gained more legal rights over their own bodies. But even in the 1930s and 40s, there are documented cases of women undergoing hysterectomies for depression or anxiety. It wasn't until the 1950s that the practice finally fell out of favour, replaced by equally problematic treatments like lobotomy and electroshock therapy. But that's a different horror story. What's the legacy of all this? Well, for one thing, it's a stark reminder of what happens when one group has complete medical authority over another group's bodies. When women couldn't refuse treatment, couldn't seek second opinions, couldn't even be told what was being done to them, the potential for abuse was unlimited. And abuse happened, systematically and on a massive scale. It's also a warning about how easily prejudice can disguise itself as science. The belief that women were inherently unstable, that their reproductive organs were the source of all their problems. This wasn't based on evidence. It was based on assumption and bias. But it was dressed up in medical terminology and surgical techniques, which gave it an appearance of legitimacy. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Echoes of this attitude persist. Women are still more likely to have their physical symptoms attributed to psychological causes. Women's pain is still undertreated. Women still have to fight harder to be believed when they say something is wrong with their bodies. The Victorian era was extreme, yes, but the fundamental dynamic, men in positions of medical authority making decisions about women's bodies, often against their will or without their full knowledge, that's a pattern that's taken a very long time to break, and in some ways we're still breaking it, kings. Hannah eventually left the asylum. She returned to her husband's home, still depressed, now also dealing with the physical consequences of surgery she never wanted. She had no legal recourse, no one to complain to. The doctors who operated on her faced no consequences. In fact, they were celebrated for their innovative approach to treating female insanity. She lived another 30 years, but she never recovered from what was done to her. How could she? They'd taken not just her organs, but her autonomy, her trust in medicine, her sense of safety in her own body. But surgery wasn't the only way Victorian medicine violated women's bodily autonomy. Because while doctors were removing organs they deemed problematic, society was creating elaborate rules and taboos around another aspect of women's bodies, their sexuality, or rather, the complete denial that women even had sexuality. Next, we're going to explore one of the most damaging myths of the Victorian era, the idea that respectable women had no sexual desire whatsoever. We're going to talk about the wedding night terror that resulted from keeping women in absolute ignorance about sex, about the double standards that allowed men to visit prostitutes but condemned women for having any carnal knowledge, and about how this systematic denial of female sexuality created trauma, broken marriages, and generations of women who were taught to view their own natural desires as evidence of moral corruption. If you thought the medical violations were disturbing, wait until you hear what emotional and psychological damage was done by the cult of female purity. Picture yourself on the night before your wedding. You're excited, nervous, looking forward to starting a new life. But you also have absolutely no idea what happens between married people. Not a vague idea, not an embarrassed understanding, nothing, zero, complete blank. You've never been told, you've never read about it. The topic has literally never been mentioned in your presence. And in the morning you're going to marry a stranger, because proper courtship meant you were never alone together. And that night, something is going to happen that you can't even begin to imagine. But you've been taught that whatever it is, if you're a good woman, you should be ashamed of it. This wasn't a rare situation. This was the expected, respectable, proper way for a Victorian woman to enter marriage. And the psychological damage it caused was catastrophic. There are documented cases of young women attempting suicide the night before their weddings, not because they didn't want to marry, but because they'd picked up just enough hints and whispers to be absolutely terrified of what marriage entailed, without having any actual information that might have eased their fears. They knew something bad was coming, they just didn't know what. Let me tell you about Beatrice. She's 19 years old, the daughter of a wealthy family in Philadelphia, and she's engaged to a respectable young man named Thomas. By all accounts, it's a good match. Thomas seems kind. The families approve. Beatrice is, by Victorian standards, fortunate. But as her wedding day approaches, Beatrice becomes increasingly anxious. She's overheard whispered conversations between married women that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. She's caught glimpses of knowing looks. Her married sister once started to say something, then changed her mind and went pale. When Beatrice asked her mother what happens on a wedding night, her mother said only, "You'll learn soon enough. A good wife submits to her husband's needs." Submits, needs, what needs? Beatrice has no framework for understanding what those words mean in this context. The night of her wedding, 1889, she's alone in the bridal chamber when Thomas enters. What happens next is something she will later describe in her diary as the most horrifying experience of my life. Not because Thomas is intentionally cruel, though his own ignorance and the rushed, awkward nature of the encounter certainly don't help, but because she's been so thoroughly unprepared that she literally doesn't understand what's happening to her. She thinks she's being assaulted. She fights back. She screams. The household is awakened. Her mother has to be called in to explain, finally, too late, that this is normal. This is marriage. This is what happens. Beatrice eventually reconciles herself to her marital duties, as Victorian women were expected to do. But she never recovers from that first night. Years later, she writes that she feels violated by the conspiracy of silence that left me defenseless against knowledge that should have been mine by right. Now, you might think Beatrice's story is an extreme example. It's not. Medical literature from the era is filled with references to the wedding night problem. Doctors wrote advice books for grooms, warning them that their brides would likely be shocked, frightened, possibly even hysterical when confronted with the physical realities of marriage. And they acknowledged this was directly caused by the systematic ignorance in which respectable young women were kept. Dr. Virgil Primrose English, and yes, that was really his name, published a book in the late Victorian era called The Doctor's Plain Talk to Young Men. In it, he counsels grooms to be patient with their new wives because, and I quote, "Her mind and habits have been so pure and free from lust that there has never been anything to produce an excitement of the sexual passions. She may be indifferent, and she may look upon it with horror." Look upon it with horror. That was the expected response. That was considered normal and proper. A woman who wasn't horrified by sex was suspect, Her purity was questionable. But here's the twisted logic at work. Women were supposed to be completely ignorant and therefore horrified by sex, but they were also supposed to transform instantly into willing, compliant wives who submitted to their husbands' desires. They were expected to go from knowing nothing to accepting everything in the space of one traumatic night. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain this contradiction were exhausting, and the contradictions ran even deeper, because while women were supposed to be pure, ignorant, and uninterested in sex, they were also expected to become mothers, which obviously requires sex. So the official line became, respectable women don't desire sex for itself. They only tolerate it as a necessary means to the end of having children. Dr. William Acton, who we've mentioned before, wrote in his 1857 treatise on reproductive organs that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind, happily for them, as if having sexual desire would be a burden, a problem, something to be grateful you'd been spared. He went on to describe the ideal wife as having love of home, of children, and of domestic duties, as the only passions they feel. Notice the word choice, passion for housework and babies, acceptable, passion for your husband, suspicious. This created an impossible situation for married couples. The husband had been told his wife wouldn't and shouldn't desire him sexually. The wife had been told that any sexual feeling she experienced was abnormal and shameful. Is it any wonder that Victorian marriages were often sexually dysfunctional? And here's where the double standard becomes blindingly obvious. While respectable women were kept in complete ignorance, young men were often actively encouraged to gain sexual experience before marriage. With whom? Well, with prostitutes, of course, or with working-class women who were considered less pure and therefore fair game for sexual exploitation. So a typical Victorian wedding night might involve a groom who's had multiple sexual experiences, all with women who were paid or coerced, trying to initiate a bride who's literally never been told that sexual intercourse exists. He's been with women who had to perform enthusiasm whether they felt it or not. She's been taught that any hint of sexual interest makes her a fallen woman. The potential for trauma on both sides is enormous. Some couples did manage to work it out. Historian Judith Feigley studied the letters of novelist Charles Kingsley and his wife. They waited an entire month after their wedding before consummating the marriage, using that time to become comfortable with each other. Once they did, their letters suggest they had a passionate, mutually satisfying sexual relationship, but they were the exception, and their ability to wait a month required that Kingsley already be more informed and patient than most Victorian men. Most couples didn't have that luxury. Most women just had to endure, and the books written to help them were often worse than nothing. Let me share some actual advice from Victorian marriage manuals. One book suggested that on the wedding night, the bride should lie still and think of England. Just endure it for the sake of duty and country. Another advised that a bride should submit with grace to the beast-like passions of her husband. Beast-like. That's how marital intimacy was described. Henry Hanchett, the same doctor who believed in menstruation through the nose, wrote that women had such low sexual drives that only truly deranged females would succumb to the temptations of masturbation. So if you experienced sexual desire when alone, you were literally insane. But wait, it gets more twisted. Some marriage manuals suggested that a woman's lack of sexual knowledge was actually more important than her physical virginity as a sign of purity. Karl Heinzen, writing in the 1880s, described the delicate shyness which the virgin feels when she is to step beyond the boundary of virginity as an ornament to every woman, and its absence is a proof of dullness and coarseness. So even if a woman somehow learned about sex before marriage, Maybe she grew up on a farm and observed animals. Maybe she read a medical text she wasn't supposed to see. She was expected to perform ignorance, to act shocked and shy and reluctant, even if she wasn't, because knowledge itself was a kind of moral stain. Do you see the trap? If you were genuinely ignorant, you were traumatized. If you somehow gained knowledge, you had to pretend to be ignorant or risk being seen as unchaste. Either way, you couldn't win, and the consequences of this enforced ignorance extended far beyond the wedding night. Women who didn't understand how conception worked couldn't effectively prevent pregnancy. And in an era before reliable birth control, this meant many women spent their entire reproductive years in a near-constant state of pregnancy or nursing. There are heartbreaking letters from Victorian women begging their doctors for information about how to avoid getting pregnant again. They'd had 6, 7, 8 children. Their bodies were exhausted. They couldn't cope with another pregnancy. But asking how to prevent conception was itself scandalous. And most doctors wouldn't tell them anyway, believing that limiting family size was immoral. Some women resorted to dangerous home remedies, douching with various solutions that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, attempting to calculate safe periods based on completely wrong information about when ovulation occurred. Some even attempted self-induced abortions using herbs or physical methods, risking their lives in the process. Others simply refused their husbands, which could lead to marital breakdown or worse. A husband could legally force himself on his wife. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. In fact, the concept didn't even exist in Victorian law. Once you were married, your body belonged to your husband. Consent was assumed to be permanent and irrevocable. Now, let me share a story that I find both tragic and telling. The writer and philosopher John Addington Symonds left a memoir in which he described his own wedding night. He wrote about how society does all that lies in us to keep them chaste, to develop and refine their sense of shame, while we leave them to imagine what they like about nuptial connection. Then we fling them naked in bed together, modest, alike ignorant, mutually embarrassed by the awkward situation, trusting that they will blunder into the conditions of a happy married life. Fling them naked in bed together. That's not romance. That's not intimacy. That's a recipe for disaster. And Symonds knew it. He was writing as a man acknowledging the cruelty and absurdity of the system, but he was rare in that acknowledgement. Most Victorian men seemed to accept the situation as normal, or if they saw problems, they blamed women for being too delicate, too sensitive, too frigid, never acknowledging that the frigidity might be a natural response to trauma and ignorance. Here's something that really drives home how deep the ignorance went. There are documented cases of couples who remained celibate for months or even years after marriage, because neither of them knew exactly what they were supposed to do. They knew something should happen, but without instruction or information, they couldn't figure out the mechanics. The most famous case is probably that of John Ruskin, the art critic and writer. His marriage to Effie Gray was never consummated. When she sought an annulment 6 years later, the investigation revealed that Ruskin had apparently been so shocked by the reality of his wife's body, specifically that she had pubic hair, which he had never seen in the classical nude paintings he studied, that he couldn't bring himself to have intercourse with her. He'd expected her body to look like a marble statue. The reality disturbed him too much. That's what happens when your entire sexual education comes from art and imagination rather than honest information. By the early 20th century, some brave voices started pushing back against this conspiracy of silence. In 1918, Mary Stopes published Married Love, a frank book about sex and marriage that actually explained things. It was scandalous. It was condemned by religious leaders. Stopes herself was called a wanton woman and worse. But the book became a massive bestseller. Why? Because people were desperate for this information. Soldiers going off to World War I bought copies for their fiancées so the women would know what to expect when the men returned. Women passed copies secretly between friends. It was literally life-changing for many people. Stopes wrote that the men who visited prostitutes and then expected their ignorant wives to magically know what to do were the product of their society, which made sexual knowledge and experience taboo. She argued that this ignorance harmed both men and women, that it created miserable marriages and damaged psychologies. She was right, of course. But even as late as 1918, saying these things openly was considered radical and dangerous. Think about what this means. For the entire Victorian era and well into the 20th century, the majority of women entered marriage with no sexual education whatsoever. Their first sexual experience was often traumatic, and they were then expected to participate in regular sexual activity, bear multiple children, and somehow find satisfaction in a relationship that began with terror and ignorance. Is it any wonder that Victorian women were diagnosed with so many nervous complaints? That they suffered from depression and anxiety? That some became what their doctors called frigid? They'd been set up to fail from the very beginning. The systematic denial of sexual education to women wasn't just an oversight or an abundance of caution. It was a deliberate tool of control. Keep women ignorant about their own bodies, and they can't make informed decisions. They can't refuse unwanted pregnancies because they don't know how. They can't advocate for their own pleasure because they've been taught they're not supposed to have any. They're dependent on men to tell them what's normal, what's acceptable, what's allowed. But while society denied that respectable women had any sexual feelings at all, it simultaneously created elaborate rules about how those supposedly non-existent feelings should be managed. And nowhere was this more evident than in the Victorian obsession with female purity and the double standard that governed sexual morality. Next, we're going to explore the myth of the asexual angel, the idea that good women had no sexual desire whatsoever, and what happened to women who failed to live up to this impossible ideal. We're going to talk about how sexual desire in women was pathologized as evidence of mental derangement, while men's desire was considered natural and healthy. And we're going to see how this double standard created a society where men could do essentially whatever they wanted sexually, while women's slightest hint of passion could ruin their lives forever. The hypocrisy is staggering, and the damage it caused reverberates to this day. There's a special kind of cruelty in telling someone that a fundamental part of their humanity doesn't exist. Imagine being told that hunger is imaginary, that thirst is a delusion, that the need for sleep is just weakness of character. Now imagine being told this about sexual desire. That if you're a good person, a moral person, a respectable person, you simply won't feel it. And if you do feel it, well, that's proof that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong with you. This was the Victorian doctrine of female asexuality. And it didn't just shape individual lives, it shaped an entire culture's understanding of what women were and what they were allowed to be. The core belief was simple and absolute. Respectable women had no sexual desire. None. Zero. Sexual feelings existed only in men and in fallen women. Prostitutes, adulteresses, the morally corrupt. A truly pure woman was, by definition, incapable of carnal passion. Dr. William Acton's 1857 declaration that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind wasn't a controversial statement in his time. It was mainstream medical opinion. It was taught in universities. It was cited in courtrooms. It shaped laws about marriage, divorce, and women's rights. But let's think about the implications for a moment. If respectable women have no sexual desire, what happens to a woman who does? What happens if you're lying in bed next to your husband and you realize you actually want him? What if you initiate intimacy? What if you experience pleasure during sex? According to Victorian morality, that makes you abnormal, possibly sick, potentially dangerous. Let me introduce you to Florence. She's 26, married for 4 years, living in Boston in 1892. Her husband James is a banker, well respected in their community. By all outward appearances, they have a solid marriage. But Florence is struggling with something she can't talk about with anyone. She enjoys marital relations with her husband. Actually, enjoys them. Sometimes she's the one who suggests they retire early. Sometimes she experiences what she's learned to recognize as physical pleasure. And this terrifies her, because everything she's been told suggests this makes her deviant. Her mother once mentioned that ladies endure, but do not enjoy their marital duties. The one medical book she managed to read suggested that excessive passion in women was a sign of nymphomania, a serious mental disorder. Even the novels she's read depict pure heroines as shrinking from physical touch, tolerating their husbands' embraces with noble resignation. So Florence begins to perform. She lies still. She doesn't initiate. She makes sure to seem reluctant, even when she isn't. She's hiding her own desire from her husband, terrified that if he knew she felt passion, he'd think less of her. He might even wonder if she had been with other men, since good women supposedly can't feel these things. The psychological toll of this deception is enormous. She starts to feel shame about her own body. She wonders if something is wrong with her. She can't talk to anyone about it because admitting sexual desire would mark her as impure. She's trapped in a marriage where genuine mutual desire has to be hidden and denied because society has decided it doesn't exist. Now, here's what makes this even more insidious. The denial of female sexuality didn't exist in a vacuum. It was paired with a very different attitude toward male sexuality. Men were understood to have strong, natural, even overwhelming sexual urges. This was considered biological fact. The male sex drive was irrepressible, uncontrollable, a force of nature that demanded outlet. See the problem? If men have powerful sexual needs but respectable women have no sexual desire at all, what's a man supposed to do? The Victorian answer was predictable and hypocritical. He should satisfy those needs elsewhere, with prostitutes, with mistresses, with any woman who fell outside the category of respectable. This created an entire two-tiered system of female sexuality. There were angels, wives, daughters, mothers, who were pure, passionless and protected. And there were fallen women, prostitutes, the poor, women of colour, anyone who existed outside the bounds of middle-class respectability, who were available for male sexual expression. The angels were worshipped but couldn't be truly desired. The fallen women could be desired but were despised and exploited. Neither category allowed for actual female humanity, for the possibility that women might be complex beings with their own desires, their own agency, their own sexual feelings that existed independent of male needs. And here's the really twisted part. This system relied on the exploitation of the very women it condemned. Victorian morality needed prostitutes to exist so that men could satisfy their natural urges without corrupting their pure wives. But it also needed to condemn those prostitutes as fallen, impure, morally contaminated. The women who made the system work were simultaneously necessary and reviled. Let me share some statistics that really drive this home. In 1860, it's estimated that there were somewhere around 80,000 prostitutes in London alone. 80,000. In a city of about 3 million people. That's one prostitute for roughly every 37 people. The actual number might have been even higher, estimates vary, but even the conservative figures show a massive industry. Who were these women? Some chose the profession, though choice is a complicated word when your alternatives are starvation or brutal factory work. Many were forced into it by poverty, by family pressure, by procurers who recruited young girls from rural areas with false promises of domestic service. Some were victims of what we'd now call human trafficking, and once you entered prostitution, the stigma made it nearly impossible to leave. You were marked as fallen forever. But Victorian men from all social classes visited prostitutes regularly. It was so common that etiquette guides included subtle advice on how to discreetly leave a brothel without being seen. Medical texts discussed the health risks of prostitution while implicitly accepting that men would continue to visit prostitutes regardless. The whole society was built on this unspoken understanding. Men need sex, respectable women can't provide it, so prostitutes are a necessary evil. The women caught in this system paid an enormous price. They faced violence, disease, social ostracism, and legal persecution. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in Britain in the 1860s, allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and subject her to invasive medical examinations. If she was found to have venereal disease, she could be forcibly confined in a hospital. Meanwhile, the men who had infected her faced no consequences whatsoever. This is where we meet Josephine Butler, and I want to tell you about her because her work was revolutionary. Butler was a social reformer who spent decades fighting against the Contagious Diseases Acts and advocating for the rights of prostitutes. She argued, radically for her time, that prostitution existed because of male demand and male exploitation, not because of female immorality. She said that men who used prostitutes should face the same social consequences as the women they paid. She was vilified for this work, called unfeminine, accused of having a prurient interest in sexual matters, threatened with violence, but she persisted, and eventually the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. Butler understood something crucial. The double standard around sexuality wasn't just unfair. It was designed to control women by splitting them into categories of pure and impure, then denying both groups their full humanity. Now let's talk about what happened to respectable women who showed signs of sexual desire. Because if you couldn't be ignored or hidden like Florence, you risked being pathologized. Henry Hanchett, that same doctor who believed in no menstruation, wrote that women had low, almost non-existent sex drive, so only truly deranged females would succumb to the temptations of masturbation. Deranged. If you experienced sexual desire when alone, when no husband required servicing, you were mentally ill. This belief had real consequences. Young women caught masturbating were sometimes sent to asylums. Some underwent the gynecological surgeries we discussed earlier, with doctors claiming that removal of the clitoris or ovaries would cure the disease of excessive sexual feeling. These weren't rare, isolated incidents. They were accepted medical practice. There's a documented case from 1893 where a 14-year-old girl was brought to a doctor because her mother had discovered her touching herself. The doctor's solution? Clitoridectomy, surgical removal of the clitoris, to cure her of self-pollution and ensure she grew up to be a proper, passionless wife. This girl was mutilated because she had normal sexual feelings. And it wasn't just masturbation that could get you labelled as sexually deviant. Any expression of desire, any sign of passion, any suggestion that you might enjoy sex was suspect. Women who were too affectionate with their husbands risked being seen as nymphomaniacs. Women who had sexual thoughts were encouraged to pray them away, to mortify the flesh, to see their desires as temptations from the devil. Some marriage advice books actually warned husbands to be suspicious if their wives seemed too enthusiastic about marital relations. One guide suggested that a wife who initiated sex or showed signs of pleasure might have been sexually active before marriage, Because remember, in the Victorian mind, respectable women only tolerated sex. They couldn't possibly enjoy it unless they had already been corrupted. Can you imagine living like this? Can you imagine having to suppress and deny such a fundamental part of yourself? Can you imagine the shame, the confusion, the self-loathing that would come from feeling something you've been told you shouldn't and can't feel? But here's what the Victorians either didn't understand or willfully ignored. Human sexuality doesn't just disappear because you declare it doesn't exist. Desire doesn't evaporate because you've decided it's the improper. And when you create a system that denies people's basic humanity, they find ways to cope, to adapt, to survive, but usually at great psychological cost. Some women internalize the message so completely that they genuinely suppressed their sexual feelings. They became the passionless angels Victorian society claimed they should be, but through learned repression rather than natural inclination. The psychological damage of this suppression often manifested in other ways: anxiety, depression, psychosomatic illnesses. Other women, like Florence, lived double lives, outwardly performing passionlessness while secretly experiencing desire. The constant need to hide this part of themselves created intense stress and shame, and some women simply couldn't reconcile what they felt with what they were told they should feel. They were the ones most likely to end up diagnosed with hysteria, nymphomania, moral insanity. Their crime was being honest about their humanity. There's a particularly telling detail in Victorian pornography, yes, it existed, extensively, that reveals the hypocrisy of the whole system. In these underground publications, women were depicted as insatiably sexual, eager, passionate. The same society that publicly declared women had no sexual feelings was privately consuming literature that portrayed exactly the opposite. What does this tell us? That the Victorian declaration of female asexuality was never about what women actually felt. It was about what they were allowed to express, to acknowledge, to claim for themselves. Public ideology and private reality existed in completely separate spheres. Even Queen Victoria, the era's namesake and supposed embodiment of purity, had a passionate relationship with Prince Albert. Her private letters and diaries reveal a woman who loved her husband deeply and physically. After Albert's death, she mourned him intensely, and part of that mourning was clearly for the loss of physical intimacy. But publicly, none of this could be acknowledged. The official story was of a noble, pure love untainted by carnal desire. The myth of female asexuality served specific social functions. It maintained male control over female sexuality by making women's desires illegitimate. It justified the sexual double standard by making men's brothel visits seem like biological necessity rather than moral choice. It kept respectable women dependent on marriage by denying them any legitimate sexual outlet outside it, and it provided an excuse for sexual dysfunction in marriages by blaming women's natural coldness rather than men's lack of skill or consideration. But this myth also did something more subtle and perhaps more damaging. It taught women to be strangers to their own bodies, to not understand their own responses, to view their physical sensations with suspicion and shame, and this alienation from one's own body, this sense that your physical self is somehow separate from your true, respectable self, this is a form of violence that's hard to even name. Florence, our woman from Boston, eventually found a way forward. She discovered, through careful listening and observation, that other women in her social circle also seemed to enjoy relations with their husbands, though they'd never admit it openly. There was a subtle language of knowing looks and carefully phrased comments that allowed married women to acknowledge, without explicitly stating, that they weren't all enduring martyrdom in the bedroom. But this underground network of shared knowledge couldn't undo the fundamental damage of a system built on denial. Florence still felt shame. She still worried she was abnormal. She just felt slightly less alone in that abnormality. The cult of female purity and asexuality was designed to control women by dividing them against themselves, splitting body from mind, desire from respectability, humanity from virtue. And like all the other aspects of Victorian medicine and society we've explored, it was based on lies. Lies about female biology. Lies about what women felt and wanted. Lies that were convenient for maintaining male power and privilege. But the denial of female sexuality was just one aspect of a larger pattern of keeping women ignorant about and alienated from their own bodies. Because there's another natural, universal female experience that Victorian society also shrouded in mystery, shame, and medical misunderstanding. An experience that every woman goes through. An experience that changes everything. We're going to talk about pregnancy and childbirth in the Victorian era, about the silence that surrounded it, the dangers that defined it, and the way society managed to turn the most natural process in the world into something shameful, terrifying, and deadly. About the women who died from infections that simple hand-washing could have prevented. About the corsets designed to hide and compress pregnant bodies, and about how even Queen Victoria, who had 9 children, described pregnancy as the shadow side of marriage and kept her condition secret from the public. If you thought the denial of sexuality was bad, wait until you see how Victorian society treated the consequence of that sexuality, the creation of new life. Because in a culture that couldn't acknowledge how babies were made, pregnancy existed in a strange limbo of shame and necessity, and the cost of that shame was measured in women's lives. Death in childbirth was so common in the Victorian era that when a woman discovered she was pregnant, she would often begin writing farewell letters to her children and loved ones, just in case. Because pregnancy wasn't just a natural part of life, it was a potentially fatal condition that women faced again and again, often having 6, 8, 10 children over the course of their reproductive years. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice with death, and yet, despite being so dangerous, despite being so central to women's lives, pregnancy was also one of the most shameful, hidden aspects of Victorian existence. The word pregnant itself was considered too vulgar for polite conversation. Women were in a delicate condition, or in confinement, or expecting an interesting event, but never ever pregnant. Even Queen Victoria, who bore 9 children, and whose era we're discussing, rarely spoke publicly about her pregnancies. In her private letters, she described pregnancy as the shadow side of marriage, and called it a miserable and unhappy time. After the birth of her first child, she wrote to her daughter years later, "What you say of the pride of giving life to an immortal soul is very fine, dear, but I own I cannot enter into that. I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments." Like a cow or a dog. That's how the Queen of England described childbirth. Not in public, of course, that would have been scandalous, but privately she acknowledged what many Victorian women felt, that pregnancy reduced them to their animal functions, that it was degrading, frightening, and anything but the glorious fulfillment of feminine destiny that society claimed it should be. Let me tell you about Margaret. She's 28 years old, living in Edinburgh in 1875. This is her 4th pregnancy. She already has 3 living children, though she's lost 2 others in infancy. When she realizes she's pregnant again, her first emotion isn't joy, it's dread. She knows what's coming, months of nausea, exhaustion, and discomfort. The gradual loss of mobility as her belly swells. The constant corset adjustments, because yes, pregnant women wore corsets, specifically designed maternity corsets that compressed their growing bodies into the fashionable silhouette. The social isolation, because heavily pregnant women were expected to withdraw from public life. It was considered indecent to display obvious pregnancy, And then, at the end of it all, the ordeal of childbirth itself, which might kill her, or might leave her with injuries that will cause pain for the rest of her life, or might result in another dead baby to grieve. Margaret doesn't complain about any of this. Complaining would mark her as weak, as insufficiently maternal, as failing in her natural role, so she keeps her fears to herself and prepares as best she can. Let's start with the maternity corset because it perfectly encapsulates Victorian priorities. Even during pregnancy, the fashionable silhouette was more important than the health of mother or baby. Maternity corsets were advertised as being specially designed for pregnant women. They had expandable panels, slightly more room in the abdomen, but they still compressed and shaped the body. The medical consequences were predictable. Restricting the abdomen during pregnancy limited the space available for the growing baby. It interfered with digestion, already difficult during pregnancy. It made breathing harder. Some doctors argued that tight corseting during pregnancy could cause miscarriage or premature birth. Others claimed it led to malformed babies. Did this stop women from wearing them? No, because the social pressure to maintain a proper appearance was too strong. And besides, many women had worn corsets since childhood. Their abdominal muscles were weak from decades of external support. Taking the corset off entirely would have left them unable to stand comfortably for any length of time. So pregnant Victorian women were trapped, literally compressed, between medical needs and social expectations, and the babies paid the price along with the mothers. Now let's talk about prenatal care, or rather the near total absence of it. Today, pregnant women see doctors regularly throughout pregnancy. They get ultrasounds, blood tests, nutritional advice. In the Victorian era, you might see a doctor once, maybe twice during an entire pregnancy. Maybe not at all until labour actually began. There was no understanding of prenatal nutrition. No one knew about folic acid or calcium requirements. Pregnant women ate whatever their families normally ate, which for working-class women often meant nutritionally inadequate diets. Anemia during pregnancy was extremely common. Gestational diabetes went undiagnosed and untreated. Women had no way to know if their babies were developing normally, no way to detect complications like placenta previa until they started hemorrhaging during labour. No warning that they were carrying twins until the second baby emerged as a surprise. Imagine going through 9 months of pregnancy with absolutely no medical monitoring, no reassurance, no information what's happening inside your body. And then there was the isolation. Once a woman's pregnancy became visibly obvious, usually around 5 or 6 months, she was expected to withdraw from society. This was called confinement, and it was literal. Women stayed home. They didn't attend social gatherings, they didn't go to church, they certainly didn't appear in public spaces. The reasoning was a mix of propriety and superstition. Visibly pregnant women were considered indecent. Their condition was proof that they'd had sexual intercourse, which was too vulgar to acknowledge. There were also old beliefs that pregnant women might mark their babies if they saw disturbing sights or experienced strong emotions. Better to keep them tucked away at home, isolated from anything that might upset them. For women who already struggled with depression or anxiety, this isolation was devastating. They were cut off from friends, from social support, from any distraction from their fears about the upcoming birth. They were alone with their worries for months. Margaret, in her Edinburgh home, spends the last 3 months of her pregnancy seeing almost no one but her husband and children. Her friends can't visit. It wouldn't be proper. She can't go to them. She sits in her room sewing baby clothes, trying not to think about the fact that 2 of the 5 babies she's carried to term didn't survive their first year, trying not to think about her friend Clara who died in childbirth just last year, leaving 4 orphaned children. When labour finally begins, Margaret's experience is both better and worse than it might have been a generation earlier. Better because she has access to chloroform for pain relief. Queen Victoria herself had famously used it during the birth of her 8th child, which helped make it acceptable. Worse, because the doctor attending her birth hasn't washed his hands and doesn't believe in antiseptic techniques. This is the 1870s, and a Hungarian doctor named Ignác Semmelweis has already proven that hand-washing dramatically reduces maternal mortality. He published his findings in 1861. But most British and American doctors rejected his ideas. They found it insulting to suggest that gentlemen physicians could be carrying disease on their hands. They continued to go directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing. The results were catastrophic. Childbed fever, what we now know was usually a streptococcal infection, killed thousands of women every year. Women who survived the actual birth would develop fever a few days later. The infection would spread through their bodies. They'd die in agony, usually within a week or two of giving birth. And here's the truly enraging part. This was preventable, completely easily preventable. Semmelweis had shown that simple hand-washing with chlorinated lime solution reduced maternal mortality from childbed fever from about 18% to less than 2%, 18% to 2%, with soap and water. But the medical establishment rejected him, called him obsessive, eventually drove him to a mental breakdown. He died in an asylum in 1865, his work largely dismissed and forgotten. It wasn't until the 1880s and 90s, when Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister's work on germ theory became widely accepted, that antiseptic practices in childbirth became standard. How many women died in those intervening decades? Tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, because doctors were too proud to wash their hands. Margaret develops a fever 3 days after giving birth. She knows what this means. She's seen it happen to other women. The fever climbs. She becomes delirious. The doctor is called back. He performs an examination with unwashed hands, introducing more bacteria. He prescribes bed rest and cooling compresses, which do nothing for a bacterial infection. Margaret survives, barely. Many women in her situation didn't. The mortality rate for childbirth in the 1870s varied by location and class, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 in 200 to 1 in 100 births resulted in the mother's death. That might not sound like much until you remember that women often had 6 or more children. Across multiple births, the cumulative risk was substantial, and that's just maternal mortality. Infant mortality was even higher. In 1870, about 15% of babies died before their first birthday. By age 5, about 25% of children were dead. Families expected to lose children. It was considered normal. Parents often didn't name babies immediately after birth, waiting to see if they would survive before becoming too attached. Can you imagine the psychological toll of this? Of knowing that any pregnancy might kill you? That even if you survived, there was a 1 in 4 chance your child wouldn't reach age 5? Of planning for your own death every time you conceived? Some women tried desperately to avoid pregnancy, but without reliable contraception this was nearly impossible. The most common method was withdrawal, which required male cooperation and was notoriously unreliable. Women tried various folk remedies, douching with vinegar, inserting sponges soaked in various solutions, calculating safe periods based on completely incorrect information about when ovulation occurred. The rhythm method, as it was later called, was based on the belief that women were most fertile immediately before and after menstruation. Exactly wrong. Ovulation typically occurs in the middle of the cycle. So women who tried to avoid pregnancy by only having intercourse during what they believed were safe periods often got pregnant precisely because they had it wrong. Some women did have access to barrier methods. Condoms existed, made from animal intestines or later vulcanized rubber. But they were expensive, unreliable, and many people considered them immoral. They were associated with prostitution and extramarital affairs, not respectable married life. Diaphragms and cervical caps existed too, but information about them was often illegal to distribute. In the United States, the Comstock laws of 1873 made it illegal to send obscene materials through the mail, and this was interpreted to include information about contraception. Women who wanted to learn about birth control had to seek out underground networks of information, risking scandal and sometimes legal consequences. Margaret, after her difficult fourth birth, desperately wants to avoid another pregnancy, but she doesn't know how. Her doctor certainly won't help. Discussing contraception with patients was considered unethical. Her husband controls when and how often they have intercourse. She's trapped in a cycle of repeated pregnancies that are destroying her health. And she's one of the lucky ones, because she's middle class and has access to medical care, however inadequate. Working class women often gave birth with no medical attendance at all. Just a midwife, if they were fortunate. Maybe a neighbour who'd helped with births before. Sometimes they laboured alone, then returned to work within days because they couldn't afford to stop earning money. The class divide in maternal care was stark. Wealthy women could afford private physicians, could spend weeks recovering in bed after birth, could hire wet nurses if breastfeeding proved difficult. Poor women had none of these options. They gave birth in cramped, unsanitary conditions. They returned to grueling physical labour while their bodies were still bleeding and healing. They couldn't afford recovery time. And if something went wrong during labour, if the baby was positioned wrong, or if the mother's pelvis was too small, there were limited interventions available. Forceps existed, but they were dangerous and often caused terrible injuries to both mother and baby. Caesarean sections were usually fatal. The surgery itself was risky, but infection afterward was almost guaranteed in the pre-antiseptic era. Some babies died in the birth canal, stuck in positions they couldn't escape. Some mothers died from exhaustion after days of labour. Some hemorrhaged to death. And doctors could do very little but watch. There's a particularly heartbreaking account from an 1868 medical journal describing a young woman who laboured for 4 days before dying of exhaustion, the baby stillborn. The attending physician wrote matter-of-factly that nature had attempted an impossibility. The baby's head was too large for the mother's pelvis. In modern times, this would be a straightforward caesarean section. In 1868, it was a death sentence for both mother and child. Now, despite all of this, despite the danger, the pain, the isolation, the lack of medical care, Victorian society maintained the fiction that pregnancy and childbirth were women's highest calling. That motherhood was so natural, so instinctive that women needed no education or preparation for it, that any difficulties women experienced were either exaggerations or evidence of moral failing. Women who expressed fear about childbirth were told they lacked faith in God's plan. Women who wanted information about their pregnancies were accused of being indelicate. Women who asked for pain relief were sometimes refused because pain in childbirth was considered biblically ordained. The curse of Eve, even Queen Victoria, when she used chloroform during childbirth, faced criticism from religious leaders who argued that women should suffer in labour as punishment for original sin. The Queen notably ignored them and used chloroform for several subsequent births. But most women didn't have the Queen's ability to disregard criticism. They suffered in silence because that's what was expected. They risked their lives repeatedly because they had no choice. And when they died, they were eulogized as having given their lives in service of their sacred duty as mothers, as if dying in childbirth was noble rather than tragic, and often preventable. Margaret survives her 4th birth, but her health never fully recovers. She suffers from what we'd now recognise as a uterine prolapse and chronic pelvic pain. She has 2 more pregnancies over the next 6 years. She had no way to prevent them. She survives both, but the sixth birth leaves her bedridden for months. She's 37 years old and feels 50. Her body has been used up by pregnancy and childbirth. And Victorian society's response: that's just how it is. That's a woman's lot. Be grateful you survived. Be grateful you have children. Stop complaining. But pregnancy and childbirth weren't the end of women's reproductive trials. There was one more biological transition that women had to face, one more phase of life that Victorian medicine completely misunderstood and mismanaged. And unlike pregnancy, which at least had some social value attached to it, this transition marked the end of a woman's usefulness in Victorian eyes. Next, we're going to explore menopause, the change of life that Victorian medicine treated as the beginning of women's decline into irrelevance. We're going to talk about how the cessation of fertility was viewed as the cessation of female value, about the treatments prescribed for menopausal symptoms from leeches to opiates to institutionalization, and about how women who are no longer young and fertile faced not just physical changes, but social erasure. Because in Victorian society, if you couldn't have babies, what good were you? There's a particular cruelty in being told that your value as a person expires at a specific biological moment, that once your body can no longer perform one particular function, creating new life, you become irrelevant, obsolete, a burden rather than a blessing. This is what Victorian society told women about menopause. Not explicitly, perhaps, but the message was unmistakable. When your monthly bleeding stopped, so did your purpose. In Victorian medical literature, menopause wasn't called menopause. It was called the change of life, the climacteric, or sometimes just the critical period. And it was discussed almost exclusively in terms of loss and decline. Loss of fertility, loss of youth, loss of femininity, loss of value. The medical establishment viewed it as the beginning of women's inevitable deterioration into old age. Dr. Edward Tilt, who published one of the most influential books on menopause in 1857, wrote that the climacteric marks an important epoch in a woman's life, often a most trying one. He described it as a transition from active womanhood to a kind of neutral declining state where women were no longer quite women anymore, but not yet elderly, stuck in an uncomfortable limbo. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. Victorian society had already defined women almost entirely by their reproductive capacity. Your value was in being a wife, in bearing children, in raising the next generation. So when that capacity ended, what were you? In the eyes of Victorian culture, you were becoming useless. Let me introduce you to Catherine. She's 49 years old, living in Liverpool in 1882. For the past year, her monthly cycles have been irregular. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. When they do come, they're heavier and more painful than they used to be. She's experiencing hot flashes that leave her drenched in sweat, especially at night. She can't sleep well. Her mood swings are dramatic. One moment she's fine, the next she's weeping or furious for no reason she can identify. Catherine knows what this means. She's entering the change of life, and she's terrified, not just of the physical symptoms, but of what this transition represents. Her husband has already started making comments about her getting older. Her grown children treat her with a new kind of dismissiveness. At social gatherings, she notices that younger women speak over her, around her, as if she's already fading into irrelevance. The physical symptoms are bad enough, but it's the social death that truly frightens her. Now, let's talk about what Victorian medicine actually understood about menopause, which was remarkably little. They knew that women's monthly bleeding eventually stopped, usually somewhere in their 40s or early 50s. They knew this was permanent. Beyond that, wild speculation and theories based more on social prejudice than biological fact. Many doctors believed that menopause was caused by the uterus and ovaries essentially wearing out from years of use. They saw it as an organ failure, a breakdown of the female system. Some thought it was related to the gradual drying up of the blood. Others believed it was connected to the nervous system exhausting itself after decades of managing the complex and delicate machinery of the female body. What they didn't understand were hormones. The concept of hormones wouldn't be discovered until the early 20th century. So Victorian doctors had no framework for understanding that menopause was caused by changing levels of estrogen and progesterone. They couldn't comprehend that hot flashes, mood changes, and sleep disturbances were the result of hormonal fluctuations rather than general physical and mental decay. This lack of understanding led to some truly bizarre treatment approaches, and I mean bizarre even by Victorian standards, which is saying something. Catherine's doctor, when she finally works up the courage to consult him about her symptoms, prescribes a treatment regimen that's typical for the time. First, leeches. Yes, leeches. Applied to the thighs or abdomen to draw off excess blood and supposedly ease the hot flashes. The theory was that if menstrual blood wasn't leaving the body through normal channels, it needed to be removed somehow, or it would cause problems. Second, laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, to be taken nightly for sleep and to calm her nerves. This was prescribed so casually, so routinely, that the addiction risk was rarely mentioned. Thousands of Victorian women became dependent on laudanum, especially during menopause when symptoms could last for years. Third, a special diet avoiding stimulating foods. No coffee, no tea, no spices, no meat unless it was boiled. The goal was to calm her overactive system. In practice, this often meant a nutritionally inadequate diet precisely when her body needed good nutrition to cope with changing hormone levels. And fourth, and this is where it gets particularly dark, if her symptoms persisted, or if she became too emotional, too difficult to manage, institutionalization was a possibility. Women experiencing severe menopausal symptoms were sometimes committed to asylums, diagnosed with climacteric insanity. Think about that for a moment. A natural biological transition could get you locked up in a mental institution. Dr. Thomas Yeoman, writing in his book Encyclopedia of Domestic Economy, classified the types of melancholy that could afflict menopausal women: gloomy melancholy, restless melancholy, mischievous melancholy, and self-complacent melancholy. The categories were so broad that virtually any emotional state could be pathologized. Irritable because you haven't slept in 3 days thanks to night sweats? Mischievous melancholy. Sad about aging and feeling invisible? Gloomy melancholy, anxious about your changing body? Restless melancholy. The diagnosis was ready-made, and the cure, rest, isolation, possibly asylum commitment, was the same no matter which type of melancholy you supposedly had. But the medical pathologizing of menopause was only part of the problem. The social implications were perhaps even more damaging. In Victorian culture, women's value was so tied to youth and fertility that aging was treated almost like a moral failing. There's a telling detail in advice books from the era. They often included sections on how women over 40 should dress and behave to avoid appearing ridiculous. The message was clear. Trying to remain attractive after menopause was pathetic. You needed to accept your diminished status gracefully. One particularly cruel piece of advice that circulated widely suggested that menopausal and postmenopausal women should be grateful when their husbands sought companionship elsewhere. The reasoning went something like this: you're no longer young and attractive. You can't give him more children. You've become irritable and difficult due to your change of life. Is it any wonder he wants to spend time with younger, more pleasant company? Can you imagine reading that? Can you imagine being told that your husband's infidelity is your fault because you had the audacity to age? Catherine experiences this firsthand. Her husband, who's only 3 years older than she is, begins spending more time at his club. He makes pointed comments about how she's not the woman he married. When she tries to talk to him about her symptoms, about how difficult she's finding this transition, he suggests she's being dramatic. He recommends she speak with her doctor about her nervous condition. The irony is rich, isn't it? Women were kept in complete ignorance about sexuality, were given no information about their bodies, were taught to fear menstruation and pregnancy. And then, when they reached menopause, when their bodies went through another major transition, they were blamed for not handling it gracefully. But let me share something that really illustrates the double standard around aging and value. Men who were 50, 60, even 70 years old were often described as being in their prime, distinguished, mature, experienced. Their aging enhanced their status and authority. Women the same age, they were past their prime, fading, declining. The very same process, aging, was interpreted completely differently depending on gender. And this wasn't just social commentary. It had real economic consequences. Widows often found themselves in dire financial situations because they were seen as bad investments. Why employ a woman over 50 when you could employ a younger one? Why remarry a menopausal woman when you could marry a younger one who could give you children? Older women without family support often ended up destitute, dependent on charity or the workhouse. And if an older woman tried to remain active, engaged, visible in society, she risked being mocked. There are countless Victorian cartoons and satirical pieces ridiculing older women who dressed fashionably, who attended social events, who dared to act as if they still mattered. The message was brutal. Your time is over. Fade into the background quietly. But not all women accepted this passively. Some fought back in the ways available to them. They became involved in charitable work, which was considered appropriate for older women. They focused their energy on their grandchildren. Some, especially widows with independent incomes, found surprising freedom in no longer being expected to be decorative or fertile. They could finally pursue interests that had been denied to them when they were younger. And a few exceptional women used their postmenopausal years to become activists and reformers. Josephine Butler, the anti-prostitution crusader we met earlier, did much of her most important work in her 50s and 60s. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing while in her 40s and continued her work for decades. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman dean of a medical school at age 57. These women found ways to matter, to contribute, to be valued despite society telling them they shouldn't be. But they were exceptions. For most Victorian women, menopause marked the beginning of a long decline into invisibility. Catherine, our woman from Liverpool, eventually adjusts to her new reality. The physical symptoms gradually subside over several years, though she battles addiction to laudanum, a battle she eventually wins, but not without cost. She finds purpose in her role as grandmother, though she notices that even her own children sometimes treat her as if she is becoming senile, as if aging has made her less intelligent. She learns to speak less, to make herself smaller, to accept that her opinions carry less weight than they once did. She watches as society celebrates young women, her daughters friends, with an attention and admiration she remembers receiving herself decades ago. And she understands, with a bitterness she rarely expresses, that this is simply how it works. Women are valued for their youth and fertility, and once those are gone, so is their value. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge something. Everything we've been talking about, the fear of the female body, the medical control, the social restrictions, all of this was experienced most intensely by middle and upper-class white women. Because class and race created additional layers of complexity and oppression, Working-class women and women of colour experienced all of these same medical prejudices and social restrictions, but they also faced entirely different challenges. They were simultaneously told their bodies were weak and delicate while being expected to perform grueling physical labour. They were denied the protection that supposedly justified restricting middle-class women, but they also didn't receive the medical care or social support that wealthier women could access. Victorian medicine's war on women's bodies wasn't experienced equally, and the intersections of class, race, and gender created unique forms of oppression that deserve their own exploration. But that's exactly where we're headed next. Because while we've focused primarily on the experiences of respectable middle-class women, there was an entire other category of women whose experiences reveal even more about how Victorian society used medicine and morality to control female bodies. Working-class women, immigrant women, women of colour, they were caught in impossible double binds, expected to be both fragile and capable of hard labour, both pure and available for exploitation. Their stories show us that the Victorian obsession with female weakness and propriety was always selective. It was about controlling women, yes, but especially about controlling which women could claim respectability and protection. And the women who couldn't claim those things, who were too poor, too foreign, the wrong colour, the wrong class, they reveal the true nature of Victorian society's relationship with women's bodies. Because when you couldn't claim the pedestal, you discovered it was never about protecting women at all. It was about preserving a very specific social order. And the women outside that order paid the highest price. You know what's fascinating about Victorian medical theory? It managed to hold two completely contradictory beliefs about women's bodies at exactly the same time. And somehow nobody seemed to notice the contradiction. On one hand, women were too delicate for physical exertion, too fragile for education, too weak to work outside the home. Their bodies were inherently frail, prone to collapse under the slightest strain. On the other hand, working-class women could labour 14 hours a day in factories. They could scrub floors, haul water, work in coal mines, stand at machines until their feet swelled and their backs gave out. They could do back-breaking physical labour that would supposedly destroy a middle-class woman's delicate constitution. How did Victorian society reconcile this? Simple, they didn't. Because the fragility of women's bodies was never really about biology. It was about class. It was about control. And working-class women's experiences prove it. Meet Annie. She's 23 years old, working in a textile mill in Manchester in 1878. She's been working in mills since she was 9 years old. Her hands are scarred from the machinery. Her lungs are damaged from breathing cotton fibres. She's had 2 children. One is still living, the other died at 6 months. She works 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, standing the entire time because sitting isn't allowed. According to Victorian medical theory, Annie should be too delicate for this work. Her female constitution should be collapsing under the strain. Her reproductive organs should be damaged by the physical labour, the long hours standing, the constant noise and stress. And you know what? They were being damaged. But not because female bodies are inherently weak, because no human body, male or female, should be subjected to those conditions. But Victorian doctors looked at working-class women like Annie and drew very different conclusions than they did about middle-class women. When a middle-class woman complained of fatigue, it was evidence of her delicate nature. She needed rest, protection, removal from stress. When a working-class woman complained of fatigue, she was being lazy. She lacked moral fibre. She needed to work harder to develop more discipline. Same symptom, completely opposite interpretation. Why? Class. Let me share a specific medical case that really illustrates this double standard. In December 1855, a woman named Mary R. was admitted to the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. Her occupation was listed as dressmaker. She'd been coughing for 3 years, recently getting worse, sometimes coughing up blood. She told the medical staff that she had always been well fed and well kept and little exposed to harsh conditions. In other words, she'd taken good care of herself. She'd tried to maintain her health. By Victorian middle-class standards, this should have been evidence of her respectability and her concern for her delicate female constitution. But there's a note in her medical record that changes everything. She was reputed as a femme du pavé, a prostitute. Suddenly, her claim to have taken care of her health was doubted. The doctors didn't believe her, because in their minds, a woman engaged in sex work couldn't possibly be taking care of herself properly. Her moral failing, as they saw it, meant her health claims were suspect. She probably had tuberculosis, which had nothing to do with her profession, and everything to do with the fact that tuberculosis was rampant in urban Victorian Britain. But the doctor's response to her case was shaped entirely by their judgment of her morality, not by objective medical assessment. Here's another case, from June 1893 at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. A man named John T. presented with weakness and weight loss. He attributed his symptoms to drafts in his office. But the medical staff took careful note of something else entirely. I'm quoting from the medical record. Patient is married, but owing to the intemperance of his wife has been separated from her for some years. He has been much neglected in consequence, careless housekeeper, badly cook food, etc., and this may have to do with his present condition. Did you catch that? John T.'s tuberculosis, because that's what he had, wasn't attributed to his work conditions or his own health. It was blamed on 2 women, his intemperate wife and his careless housekeeper. Women who weren't even the patient. Women whose domestic failures supposedly caused a man's illness. This is the pattern throughout Victorian medical records involving working-class women. When middle-class women were sick, their illness was evidence of their delicate nature. When working-class women were sick, it was evidence of their moral or hygienic failures. And when men were sick, somehow it was still often women's fault. Now let's talk about the actual conditions working-class women faced, because the reality was brutal. Factory work was extremely dangerous. Women working in textile mills faced constant risk of injury from machinery. Fingers, hands, even entire arms could be caught in the equipment. There was no safety equipment, no workers' compensation if you were injured. If you lost a hand in a machine, you lost your job and your income. Simple as that. The hours were punishing. 12 to 14 hours a day was standard, sometimes longer during busy seasons. And remember, there were no labour laws protecting workers, no maximum hours, no required breaks, no overtime pay. You worked until the shift ended, and if you couldn't keep up, you were replaced. The pay was a fraction of what men earned for similar work. A male factory worker might earn 15 to 20 shillings a week. A woman doing comparable work would earn 6 to 8 shillings. The justification? Women didn't need as much money because they weren't supporting families. Never mind that many working-class women were, in fact, supporting families, as widows, as women with disabled or absent husbands, as unmarried mothers. Annie, our mill worker in Manchester, earns 7 shillings a week. Out of that, she pays 3 shillings for rent on a single room where she lives with her surviving child. 1 shilling goes to the woman who watches her child during the day. The remaining 3 shillings have to cover food, fuel, clothing, everything else. It's not enough. It's never enough. She's constantly choosing between eating enough or keeping her child warm. And if she gets sick, if she needs to miss work, there's no sick pay. Miss a day, lose a day's wages. Miss a week, lose your job. So women worked through illness. They worked through the pain of injuries. They worked days after giving birth because they couldn't afford not to. There are accounts of women hemorrhaging at their factory stations, bleeding through their skirts because they couldn't risk leaving their posts. Domestic service was another major employer of working-class women. Sounds less dangerous than factory work, right? But domestic servants faced their own particular vulnerabilities. You lived in your employer's home, completely at their mercy. Your hours were whenever they wanted you to work, which could mean being on call 20 hours a day. Your living conditions depended entirely on your employer's generosity. Some got decent rooms and adequate food. Others slept in attics or basements, in cold, damp conditions that bred illness. And sexual exploitation was rampant. A domestic servant, especially a young one, was vulnerable to assault from the men of the household, the master, his sons, male guests. If she became pregnant as a result, she'd be fired immediately, cast out without references. The man faced no consequences. She faced ruin. There's a heartbreaking pattern in Victorian records of young women, 14, 15, 16 years old, dismissed from service for immoral behaviour when they became pregnant. No mention of who got them pregnant, no acknowledgement that they might have been raped, just dismissal and disgrace. And here's where the double bind really becomes clear. Remember all those Victorian ideals about female delicacy and purity? They only applied if you could afford them. Middle-class women were protected from physical labour because it would damage their reproductive systems. Working-class women did physical labour that definitely damaged their reproductive systems, but that was seen as inevitable, acceptable, just the price of being poor. Middle-class women were kept ignorant about sex to preserve their purity. Working-class women were assumed to be impure, so their sexual exploitation was seen as less serious. Middle-class women who got sick were fragile flowers needing rest and care. Working-class women who got sick were malingerers or victims of their own poor hygiene. The Victorian ideal of feminine weakness was a luxury good. Only women who could afford to be weak were allowed to be weak. Everyone else had to be strong, had to work, had to survive, but they still weren't given credit for that strength. Instead, they were condemned for not living up to ideals that were economically impossible for them to achieve. Now, let's talk about healthcare access, because the class divide here was stark. Middle-class women saw private physicians. They could afford medical care, even if that care was often misguided. Working-class women had very limited options. There were charity hospitals and dispensaries, but these were overcrowded and underfunded. The care was minimal, and there was often a moral judgment attached to receiving charity healthcare. You had to prove you were the deserving poor, respectable, hard-working, not responsible for your own misfortune. If you were sick because you worked in unsafe conditions, potentially deserving. If you were sick because of malnutrition from inadequate wages, maybe deserving. If you were sick because you were a prostitute, definitely not deserving. And childbirth? Middle-class women had physicians attend them, had weeks of recovery time, had support. Working-class women often had only a midwife or a neighbour, gave birth in unsanitary conditions, and returned to work within days. The maternal mortality rate varied significantly by class. Wealthy women certainly died in childbirth. We talked about that, but they died at lower rates than poor women. Poor women died from the same infections, but more frequently. They also died from complications related to malnutrition, from attempting to continue working too soon after birth, from lack of any medical care at all. Annie gave birth to her second child in her single rented room. A neighbour who'd helped with births before attended her. There was no physician, no pain relief, no sterile conditions. She hemorrhaged badly and nearly died. 3 days later, she was back at the mill because she couldn't afford to miss more work. The bleeding hadn't fully stopped. She felt faint and weak. But she stood at her machine for 12 hours because the alternative was destitution. Think about that. 3 days after giving birth, standing for 12 hours, operating dangerous machinery while weak from blood loss. And Victorian society had the audacity to claim women were too delicate for physical exertion. Here's another dimension of the working class experience that's crucial to understand: the environmental health hazards these women faced. Working class neighbourhoods had open sewers, contaminated water supplies, overcrowded housing where tuberculosis and other infectious diseases spread easily, air pollution from factories. Working class women weren't just facing the health risks of their jobs, they were living in environments that were actively toxic. And when outbreaks of disease occurred, who got blamed? Often working class women. They were accused of being dirty, not maintaining proper hygiene, of spreading disease through their moral failings. Never mind that they didn't have access to clean water. Never mind that their housing conditions made cleanliness nearly impossible. Never mind that the factories where they worked were breeding grounds for disease. The blame fell on them personally, on their supposed moral and hygienic deficiencies. There's a fascinating and infuriating medical paper from 1870 that discusses tuberculosis among working-class women. It attributes the high rates of TB among female factory workers to their tendency to congregate in close quarters and their lack of proper ventilation in their homes. No mention that factory owners packed workers together to maximize profit. No mention that landlords rented out rooms too small for the number of people living in them. No mention that the women had no choice in these conditions, just victim blaming dressed up in medical language. But working-class women weren't passive victims. They fought back in the ways available to them. They formed mutual aid societies, pooling resources to help each other through illness and crisis. They went on strike for better conditions, despite the risk of losing their jobs and facing violence from police or hired thugs. They organised, they resisted, they survived. The match girls' strike of 1888 is a perfect example. Women working in match factories were developing phossy jaw, a horrible condition caused by white phosphorus used in matchmaking. Their jaws would literally rot away. The condition was agonizing and often fatal. When they went on strike demanding better conditions and an end to the fine system that kept them in poverty, they were condemned as difficult, ungrateful, and unfeminine. How dare they demand better treatment? How dare they organize and resist? But they won. Public outcry forced the match companies to improve conditions. These supposedly weak, delicate creatures organized a successful strike and changed their industry. Because working-class women weren't weak, they'd never had the luxury of being weak. They were strong, resilient, and capable, they just weren't given any credit for it. The Victorian medical establishment's treatments of working-class women reveal something crucial. The entire ideology of female weakness was a tool of class oppression as much as gender oppression. It kept middle-class women restricted and dependent, and it denied working-class women the protection and support they desperately needed, because acknowledging that harsh conditions were harming them would have required changing those conditions. Better to maintain the fiction that working-class women were simply different, more robust, less refined, capable of enduring what delicate ladies could not. And if they suffered, well, that was just the natural order of things. Annie continued working in the mill for another 15 years. Her surviving child grew up and eventually went to work in the same mill. The cycle continued. Annie died at 41. Exhausted, used up by years of brutal labour. Her death certificate listed tuberculosis as the cause. But the real cause was a society that valued profit over people and used pseudoscientific theories about delicate female constitutions to justify treating different classes of women in completely opposite ways. But even as working-class women were fighting for survival in the Victorian era, even as middle-class women were trapped in their own gilded cages, change was coming, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, because women were beginning to organize, to speak out, to demand something different. In our final chapter, we're going to explore how the Victorian system finally started to crack, how women fought back, as individuals, as groups, as movements, how medical understanding slowly, grudgingly began to improve, how the 20th century brought new possibilities, new freedoms, and yes, new challenges. Because the legacy of Victorian attitudes about women's bodies didn't disappear overnight, some of it lingers even today. We're going to talk about the brave women who challenged these systems, who demanded education, who fought for the vote, who revolutionized medicine and nursing. And we're going to reflect on what lessons we can learn from this dark chapter of history. Lessons that are still relevant as we continue to fight for bodily autonomy, medical equity, and the simple right to be fully human and in our own bodies. The story gets better from here. Not perfect, but better. And that matters. Every revolution begins with someone saying no. Sometimes it's a loud public refusal. Sometimes it's a quiet act of defiance witnessed by no one. But it starts with the decision that things cannot continue as they are, that the pain has become unbearable, that something must change. For Victorian women, that no came in many forms. And slowly, painfully, those individual refusals began to add up to something bigger, something that would eventually crack the foundations of the entire system we've been exploring. The change didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen smoothly. And it certainly didn't happen without fierce resistance. But it happened. And tonight, in this final chapter of our journey, we're going to explore how. Let me start with a woman you might not have heard of, but whose work changed everything. Her name was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and in 1865 she became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain. Think about what that means. Every doctor we've talked about in this entire series, every physician who diagnosed hysteria, who prescribed rest cures, who performed unnecessary surgeries, who kept women in ignorance about their own bodies, every single one of them had been a man. Elizabeth changed that. But getting there wasn't simple. Medical schools refused to admit her. When she tried to attend lectures, male students protested so loudly that she was banned. So she found loopholes. She studied privately. She apprenticed with sympathetic physicians. She eventually qualified through the Society of Apothecaries, which had a loophole in its rules that didn't explicitly exclude women, an oversight they quickly corrected after she qualified, ensuring no other woman could follow the same path. But here's what matters. Once she became a physician, she immediately began challenging the medical establishment's assumptions about women. She published papers showing that women were capable of rigorous intellectual work without damaging their health. She advocated for women's admission to medical schools. She opened a hospital staffed entirely by women, providing healthcare to women who are uncomfortable with male physicians. She proved, simply by existing and practicing medicine competently, that everything the medical establishment had said about women's intellectual limitations was wrong. And she wasn't alone. Other women were fighting similar battles in different arenas. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing, transforming it from a disreputable occupation into a respected profession. She applied statistical analysis to healthcare, showing through data that simple hygiene measures could dramatically reduce hospital mortality. She proved that women could master complex scientific concepts and apply them to save lives. Josephine Butler, as we've discussed, fought tirelessly against the sexual exploitation of women, against the double standards that punished women for prostitution while excusing the men who created the demand. She built a movement that eventually achieved legislative change, repealing the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1886. In the United States, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby was publishing scientific studies in the 1870s that demolished the myth of women's physical weakness. She showed that women who were given proper nutrition, exercise, and education were just as strong and capable as men. She proved that the supposed frailty of women was the result of corsets, restrictive clothing, poor diet, and enforced inactivity, not inherent biological weakness. These women were exceptional, yes, but they were also part of a larger shift, because by the late 19th century, more and more women were beginning to question the restrictions placed on them. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. Women were demanding the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to education, the right to control their own bodies and lives. They were organizing, marching, speaking publicly despite being told that public speaking was unladylike and dangerous to their health. And they were being arrested, force-fed, brutalized. But they kept fighting. One of the most powerful acts of resistance came from the suffragettes, who went on hunger strikes when imprisoned. The government's response was forced feeding, a brutal, traumatic procedure. But remember what we learned about hysteria. Refusal to eat was considered a symptom, so the authorities justified forced feeding not just as punishment, but as medical treatment for these hysterical women. The suffragettes turned this back on them. They publicized what was being done to them. They made the brutality visible, and public opinion began to shift. People started asking if these women are strong enough to endure forced feeding, to continue their activism despite imprisonment and violence. How can they possibly be too weak to vote? But political change was only one part of the transformation. Medical understanding was evolving too, though frustratingly slowly. The discovery of germ theory in the 1880s finally explained childbed fever and led to antiseptic practices in childbirth. Maternal mortality began to drop, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. Women were dying less frequently from infections that had been killing them for centuries. The development of anesthesia gave women options for pain relief during childbirth, though many doctors still resisted providing it, clinging to the old idea that pain in childbirth was biblically ordained. And gradually, very gradually, the conspiracy of silence around sex and reproduction began to crack. In 1918, Mary Stopes published Married Love, the book we mentioned earlier. It was explicit about sex in a way that shocked Victorian sensibilities. It explained female anatomy. It acknowledged that women could and should experience sexual pleasure. It provided practical information about contraception. The book was condemned by religious leaders, banned in some places, called obscene and dangerous, but it sold hundreds of thousands of copies because women and men were desperate for this information. They'd been kept in ignorance for so long, and finally someone was willing to tell them the truth. Soldiers returning from World War I bought copies for their fiancés, wanting to spare them the wedding night terror we explored earlier. Women passed copies secretly between friends. It was literally changing lives, one reader at a time. Stopes faced enormous backlash. She was called immoral, accused of encouraging promiscuity, threatened. But she persisted, and her work paved the way for greater openness about sexuality and reproductive health. World War I itself accelerated change in ways nobody had anticipated. When men went to war, women took their jobs. They worked in munitions factories, in hospitals, on farms, in port offices. They drove ambulances and trams. They did physically demanding work that would have been declared impossible for delicate female constitutions just a few years earlier. And they proved definitively that they were capable, that the supposed fragility was a myth, that given opportunity, women could do almost anything men could do. After the war, there was pressure to send women back to domestic roles to restore the old order. But something fundamental had shifted. Women had tasted independence, had earned their own money, had proven their capabilities. Many weren't willing to go back to being ornamental dependents. Fashion changed too in ways that had real health implications. The tight lacing corset fell out of favour. The new silhouette of the 1920s was straight and loose, requiring no compression of the waist. For the first time in over a century, women could breathe freely. And remember chlorosis, that mysterious disease that affected thousands of young women. It vanished. Medical journals in the 1930s and 40s published papers asking, whatever happened to green sickness? The answer was becoming clear. It had never been a real disease. It had been a collection of symptoms caused by corsets, poor nutrition, and enforced idleness. Remove those conditions and the disease disappeared. The connection was so obvious that even resistant doctors had to acknowledge it. In 1952, The Lancet published an article titled Corsets and Chlorosis, explicitly linking the disappearance of the disease to the abandonment of tight lacing. By the mid-20th century, many of the specific practices we've discussed were finally being abandoned. Gynecological surgery for mental illness was discredited. The rest cure was recognized as harmful. Hysteria was eventually removed from diagnostic manuals, though the last traces didn't disappear until the 1980s. Medical schools opened to women, though progress was slow and resistance fierce. By the 1970s, women made up about 10% of medical students. Today, in many countries, women are the majority of medical students. The profession that once excluded women entirely is now increasingly female. But, and this is important, we can't pretend that all the problems disappeared. The legacy of Victorian attitudes about women's bodies persist in subtle and not so subtle ways. Women are still more likely than men to have their pain dismissed or undertreated. Studies show that women wait longer in emergency rooms, are less likely to be given pain medication, and are more likely to have their symptoms attributed to anxiety or stress rather than physical causes. The word hysterical might not be in medical textbooks anymore, but the attitude behind it, the assumption that women are more emotional, less reliable reporters of their own symptoms, that lingers. Women with conditions like endometriosis often wait years for diagnosis because their pain is dismissed as normal menstrual discomfort or exaggeration. Women having heart attacks are misdiagnosed because their symptoms don't match the typical male presentation that medical students are taught, and reproductive healthcare remains a battleground. Access to contraception, to abortion, to comprehensive sex education, these are still contested, still political, still wrapped up in questions of morality and control that echo Victorian attitudes about female purity and the proper role of women. So yes, things are better, dramatically better. Women in most of the developed world have legal rights, educational opportunities, career options, and bodily autonomy that Victorian women couldn't have imagined. We have effective contraception. We have safe legal abortion in many places. We have pain relief in childbirth. We have antibiotics to treat infections. We have medical knowledge about our bodies, but the fight isn't over. Because at its core, the Victorian treatment of women's bodies was about power, about who gets to make decisions, who gets to define what's normal, who gets to control reproduction and sexuality. And those questions haven't been fully resolved. Today, right now, there are ongoing debates about who controls reproductive decisions, how seriously medical professionals take women's pain and symptoms, whether comprehensive sex education should be provided, how we talk about menstruation, menopause, and female sexuality, what standards of beauty are imposed on women's bodies, how much of women's value is still tied to youth and fertility. These aren't new questions, they're echoes of Victorian attitudes, adapted to modern contexts. So what can we learn from this history? What lessons can we take from the experiences of Victorian women into our own time? First, never trust anyone who claims to be restricting you for your own protection. Victorian doctors genuinely believed they were helping women by keeping them ignorant, by limiting their activities, by performing surgeries without consent. But help that disempowers you isn't help. It's control dressed up in concern. Second, your body is not your enemy. Victorian women were taught to fear their own biology, their menstruation, their sexuality, their capacity for pregnancy, their aging. That fear served the interests of those in power, not the interests of women themselves. Your body is not a problem to be solved. It's part of who you are. Third, when medicine and morality get tangled together, when healthcare becomes about enforcing social norms rather than promoting well-being, danger follows. The Victorian medical establishment used their authority to pathologize normal female biology and punish women who didn't conform. We need to remain vigilant against similar abuses today. Fourth, solidarity matters. The women who fought back, the suffragettes, the early female doctors, the reformers, they didn't do it alone. They built movements, supported each other, organized collectively. Individual resistance is important, but collective action changes systems. And finally, progress is possible. It's not inevitable, it's not guaranteed, and it requires constant effort. But change can happen. The Victorian system seemed unshakable, eternal, natural, but it cracked, it fell. Because people refused to accept it, fought against it, imagined something better. If you take nothing else from this long journey through Victorian women's history, take this. You have the right to understand your own body, to make decisions about it, to have your experiences believed and your pain taken seriously. That's not radical. That's basic human dignity, and it's something Victorian women were denied but fought to claim for future generations. We owe them the debt of continuing that fight, of not accepting dismissal, of not internalizing shame, of not letting our bodies become battlegrounds for other people's ideologies. Your body is yours. That simple truth cost countless women their health, their freedom, sometimes their lives to establish. Don't let anyone take it away. So here we are, at the end of this journey through one of history's darkest chapters in the treatment of women's bodies. We've explored the medical myths, the social restrictions, the real suffering of real women who were taught to fear their own biology. It's been heavy, I know, of what we've discussed has been genuinely disturbing. But I hope it's also been illuminating. I hope understanding where these attitudes came from helps us recognize when echoes of them appear in our own time. Thank you for staying with me through this entire exploration. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort, to learn about suffering, to honor the experiences of women whose stories deserve to be told. Your attention matters. Your understanding matters. If this series has moved you, if it's changed how you think about women's health and bodily autonomy, if it's made you angry about injustice or grateful for progress, or determined to keep fighting, please share it. Share it with the women in your life who might need to hear it. Share it with people who work in healthcare. Share it with anyone who might benefit from understanding this history. And I'd love to hear from you. What surprised you most in this series? What made you angry? What gave you hope? Leave a comment and let me know. I read every one. This is just one story in the vast tapestry of history. There are so many more stories to tell, stories of resilience, of resistance, of human beings facing impossible circumstances and somehow surviving, somehow fighting back, somehow creating change. I'll be back soon with another journey through history's forgotten corners. Until then, take care of yourselves, listen to your bodies, believe in your own experiences, and remember, you are not too much, you're not too difficult, and you are definitely not hysterical. Sleep well, everyone, and thank you for listening.